A black girl gave her eyes to her boyfriend to see the world, but he used them to betray her. Welcome, dearest souls, new to our circle of light. Share your radiant name below. We're thrilled to embrace you. To our treasured returning souls, you are the soul of our mission, and we honor your presence deeply. Join us to stay connected on this uplifting journey of love, peace, and renewal. Each story we bring is a blessing crafted with you in mind. Now, breathe in deeply, feel the warmth of love, and let your heart's journey unfold. The summer breeze drifted through the open window, carrying with it the sounds of children's laughter from the neighborhood playground. Inside the modest two-story house on Maple Street, 5-year-old Charles Bolivar sat alone in his room, his small fingers tracing the raised dots of his first Braille book. While other children his age were learning to identify colors and shapes in picture books, Charles was learning to read with his fingertips, navigating a world of perpetual darkness. From the moment of his birth, Charles had been different. The doctors had discovered a rare genetic condition that had left him blind. His beautiful hazel eyes, a cruel gift from genetics, unable to perceive the world around him. His mother, Elena Bolivar, had wept for days after the diagnosis. Her dreams of watching her firstborn son discover the world through wide-eyed wonder shattered in an instant. "He's still perfect," his father, Marcus Bolivar, had whispered to Elena in those early days. Though his voice carried an undertone of disappointment that would grow deeper with each passing year, "He's just different. Different." That word would follow Charles throughout his childhood like a shadow, though he couldn't see shadows at all. Different became the whispered explanation at family gatherings, the hushed conversation topic among relatives, the unspoken barrier between Charles and the world he could never fully join. As Charles grew, his physical beauty became both a blessing and a curse. By age 7, he had developed striking features that turned heads, thick dark hair that fell in natural waves, high cheekbones that gave him an almost aristocratic appearance, and a gentle smile that seemed to light up his unseeing eyes. Yet this beauty only served to heighten the tragedy in many people's eyes, as if his blindness was somehow more cruel because of his appealing appearance. "Such a shame," his Aunt Margaret would often say during family visits, not realizing that Charles's other senses had sharpened to compensate for his lack of sight. He could hear every whispered comment, feel every pitying pat on his head, sense every uncomfortable shift in the room when he entered. He could have been such a handsome catch. The arrival of his siblings only complicated Charles's world further. First came Maria, when Charles was 3, followed by Thomas 2 years later. Both children were blessed with perfect vision, and as they grew, the contrast between their achievements and Charles's limitations became increasingly apparent in their parents' eyes. "Look, Mum, I drew a butterfly," Maria would exclaim, her artwork promptly finding its place of honor on the refrigerator. "Tommy scored a goal in soccer today," his father would announce proudly at dinner, while Charles quietly ate his carefully arranged plate of food, every item in its designated spot so he could find it without assistance. It wasn't that his parents didn't love him. They did, deeply and painfully. But their love came wrapped in layers of grief, disappointment and uncertainty. They never quite learned how to celebrate Charles's achievements with the same enthusiasm they showed for his siblings' more conventional accomplishments. When Charles learned to navigate the house independently with his cane at age 6, his mother's response was more relief than joy. When he mastered Braille reading faster than his sighted peers learned regular reading, his father's praise was tempered with sadness. It was as if every milestone Charles reached reminded them of the conventional achievements he would never attain. School became another battlefield entirely. His parents had fought to keep him in mainstream education, believing it would help him integrate better with society. But integration proved to be a double-edged sword. While some teachers went above and beyond to accommodate his needs, Others seemed overwhelmed by the additional attention he required. "Charles, why don't you sit this activity out?" became a common refrain during art classes, physical education, and any other subjects that seemed too challenging to adapt. Each time, Charles would retreat to his corner, listening to the happy chaos of his classmates, participating in activities he could only imagine. Yet within this darkness, Charles developed an inner world, rich with texture and sound. He learned to identify people by their footsteps, his mother's quick, light steps, his father's heavy tread, Maria's skipping gait, and Tommy's perpetual run. He could tell his siblings' moods by the subtle changes in their breathing patterns, and knew when his mother had been crying by the slight congestion in her voice that others missed. His room became his sanctuary, a space he knew intimately by touch and sound. The rough bark of the tree branch that scratched against his window during storms, the smooth wooden desk where he did his homework, the soft carpet with its subtle pattern he could feel beneath his feet, these became his anchors in a world he couldn't see. Music became his first true love. When he was 8, his grandmother gave him a small keyboard, and Charles discovered he had an extraordinary gift. His fingers found the keys naturally, and soon he was playing complex melodies by ear. It was the first time he saw his parents' pride without reservation, the first time his difference felt like an advantage rather than a disability. "Close your eyes," he once told Maria during a piano lesson, "and tell me what you hear." "Just music," she had replied, puzzled. "No," Charles said softly, his fingers dancing across the keys. "Listen deeper. There are stories in every note, colors in every chord." But despite these moments of connection, the gap between Charles and his family continued to widen as the years passed. Family photos captured moments he could never see, holiday gatherings, birthday parties, school events, each one a reminder of his separation from the visual world his family inhabited. His mother's attempts to include him often missed the mark, her well-meaning efforts highlighting rather than bridging the divide. "Look at this, Charles. Oh, I mean feel this," she would say, catching herself too late, the awkward silence following such slips growing heavier each time. By his 10th birthday, Charles had developed a quiet resilience that both impressed and worried those around him. He rarely complained about his condition, faced each new challenge with determination, and maintained a gentle demeanor that masked the deep loneliness he carried within. During family dinners, he would listen to his siblings describe their days, Maria's art projects, Tommy's sports adventures, while carefully cutting his food into manageable pieces, each movement precise and practiced. His own daily victories, navigating a new route to class, mastering a complicated piece of music, learning to read complex mathematical equations in Braille, seemed pale in comparison to the vibrant experiences of his sighted siblings. "Charles, honey, do you want to tell us about your day?" his mother would ask, her voice carrying that special tone reserved for him, a mixture of encouragement and pity that made his stomach knot. "It was fine," became his standard response, though some days were far from fine. Days when he stumbled in the hallway at school, when he couldn't find his way to a new classroom, when he heard the whispered comments of classmates who thought he couldn't hear them. These experiences he kept to himself, not wanting to add to his parents' evident burden of worry. Yet through it all, Charles developed an extraordinary sensitivity to the world around him. He could tell when someone was sad by the subtle changes in their voice, sense tension in a room by the way people shifted in their seats, and understand complex emotions through the smallest variations in touch and tone. This sensitivity, however, also meant he felt every slight more deeply, every dismissal more keenly. When relatives would visit and fuss over his siblings while awkwardly patting his head, he felt the difference in their touch. When his father's voice swelled with pride describing Tommy's latest sports achievement, but remained measured when mentioning Charles's academic success, he heard the distinction clearly As he approached his teenage years, Charles began to understand that his blindness affected not just him, but shaped his entire family's dynamic. His parents' marriage showed the strain of years of additional worry and responsibility. His siblings, while loving, sometimes resented the extra attention and accommodation he required. Family outings had to be carefully planned around his needs, spontaneity sacrificed for safety and accessibility. Yet within this complex web of family relationships and societal expectations, Charles maintained an inner strength that would later prove crucial to his survival. He learned to find beauty in the world through means other than sight. The warmth of sunlight on his face, the texture of tree bark beneath his fingers, the complex harmonies of rainfall on different surfaces. In his darkest moments, usually late at night when the house was quiet and he could hear his siblings breathing peacefully in their rooms, Charles would sit by his window, feeling the cool glass beneath his fingers. He would imagine what the stars looked like, creating pictures in his mind based on the descriptions he'd read in his Braille books. In these moments, his blindness felt less like a disability and more like a different way of experiencing the world, not better or worse, just different. This perspective would eventually become his strength, though he didn't know it yet. As he lay in bed each night, listening to the sounds of his house settling and his family sleeping, Charles would often think about what it meant to truly see. Perhaps, he would reflect, seeing wasn't just about using your eyes. Perhaps it was about understanding, about feeling, about experiencing the world in whatever way you could. As the first chapter of Charles's life drew to a close, and his teenage years approached, he had already learned lessons that most people take a lifetime to understand. He had learned that disability doesn't define a person, that strength often comes from adaptation rather than power, and that love, even imperfect, uncertain love, can sustain you through the darkest of times. Little did he know that these early lessons, painful as they were preparing him for an extraordinary journey, one that would teach him about true sight, about love that transcends physical appearance, and about the kind of sacrifice that can only come from the deepest understanding of what it means to truly see. In the years to come, Charles would discover that his childhood in darkness had given him a unique ability to see things that others, despite their perfect vision, often missed. But for now, he remained the beautiful blind boy on Maple Street, navigating his world one careful step at a time, unaware that his greatest challenges and his greatest joys still lay ahead. As the summer breeze continued to carry the sound of children's laughter through his window, Charles ran his fingers over his Braille book one more time, a small smile playing on his lips. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, and new opportunities to prove that sight was not the only way to see the world. And somehow, in his heart, he knew that this was just the beginning of his story. The cruel face of society. The hallways of Jefferson High School echoed with the usual morning chaos, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking against polished floors, and the constant buzz of teenage conversations. For most students, this cacophony was just background noise, but for Charles Bolivar, now 15, it was a complex audio map that helped him navigate his daily journey through what often felt like a battlefield. Each sound told a story. The pitch of voices indicated where groups were gathering, the rhythm of footsteps warned of approaching bodies, and the subtle changes in air pressure suggested when he was passing open classroom doors. After 3 years at Jefferson High, Charles had mastered this invisible landscape, though mastery didn't always equal acceptance. That morning started like any other, with Charles making his way through the corridor, his white cane sweeping in practiced arcs before him. He'd learned to move with a grace that belied his blindness, his tall frame carrying itself with quiet dignity despite the obstacles, both physical and social, that lay in his path. "Hey, look who it is!" came a whisper that carried clearly to Charles's sensitive ears. "Mr. Perfect Face with the broken eyes." The speaker was Drake Matthews, a junior whose voice Charles had learned to recognize and avoid. Drake had made it his personal mission to remind Charles that being handsome didn't make up for being different. The irony wasn't lost on Charles. His appearance, which he had never seen himself, seemed to offend some people as much as his disability. Charles continued walking, pretending he hadn't heard. His first class was advanced literature, one of the few subjects where he felt truly equal to his peers. His Braille textbooks and exceptional memory had made him one of the top students in the class, though this achievement, like many others, came with its own price. "I bet he's memorized the whole book," he'd once overheard a classmate say. "It's not fair that they grade him the same as us." The unfairness, Charles thought, lay in the assumption that his different way of reading somehow made it easier, as if running his fingers over raised dots for hours was somehow cheating. But he had learned early on that defending himself often made things worse. Silence, he'd discovered, was sometimes the best shield. Miss Peterson, his literature teacher, was one of the few who seemed to truly understand. She had taken the time to learn about his needs without making him feel like a burden. That morning, as Charles settled into his usual seat near the front, she quietly placed a Braille copy of their new reading assignment on his desk. "We're starting The Picture of Dorian Gray today," she announced to the class. "Charles, I've made sure your copy includes the original preface." A few snickers echoed from the back of the room at the mention of a picture in relation to the blind student, but Miss Peterson's sharp ahem quickly silenced them. Charles felt a surge of gratitude for her subtle protection, even as his cheeks burned with embarrassment. The morning classes passed without major incident, but lunchtime always brought its own special kind of torture. The cafeteria was a maze of unpredictable obstacles, moving chairs, dropped food, and clustering students who often forgot or ignored his need for clear paths. Charles had learned to pack his own lunch and eat in the music room, where the ancient piano became his only companion. But that day, even his sanctuary wasn't safe. He was halfway through his sandwich when he heard the door open and multiple footsteps enter. Drake and his followers, he realized with a sinking feeling. "Well, well," Drake's voice carried artificial sweetness. "If it isn't our resident Ray Charles playing us a tune today, maestro." Charles remained silent, carefully wrapping the remainder of his lunch. He had learned that engaging often made things worse, but sometimes silence wasn't enough. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Drake moved closer, his voice hardening. "Or are you deaf as well as blind?" "I'd prefer to eat in peace," Charles replied quietly, gathering his things. "Peace?" Drake laughed. "You know what's not peaceful? Having to watch you walk around here like you own the place, getting special treatment, making the rest of us look bad." The irony of Drake's words, "having to watch," might have been funny in another context. But there was nothing humorous about the situation as Charles felt his lunch bag being snatched from his hands. "Let's play a game," Drake announced to his audience. "Hide and seek. Blind man's bluff. That's more your style, right?" Charles heard his lunch being tossed across the room, heard the snickers and shuffling feet of Drake's companions. He remained seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap, though his heart was racing. He had been through this before, showing fear only made it worse. "What's wrong?" Drake taunted. "Can't find your lunch? Here, let me help you." His footsteps approached again, and Charles tensed, preparing for whatever might come next. But then another sound cut through the tension, the sharp click of dress shoes on tile. "What exactly is going on here?" Mr. Harrison, the music teacher, asked from the doorway. The atmosphere in the room instantly changed. Charles could hear Drake and his friends shuffling backward, their bravado deflating under adult supervision. "Nothing, sir," Drake mumbled. "We were just leaving." "Indeed you were." Mr. Harrison's voice was cold. "And you'll be leaving your names with me as well, principal's office, all of you, now." As the footsteps retreated, Charles felt Mr. Harrison's gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you all right, Charles?" "Yes, sir," Charles replied, standing carefully. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Mr. Harrison said quietly. "I should have been here sooner. This isn't the first time, is it?" Charles shook his head slightly. What could he say? That this was just one incident among many? That for every teacher who intervened, there were dozens of moments when no one was around to help? The afternoon classes were a blur of whispered comments and subtle jabs. News of the music room incident had spread, and while Drake and his friends were presumably in trouble, their supporters made sure Charles felt the consequences of snitching. His last class of the day was chemistry, which presented its own unique challenges. Partner work was required, and while some students were willing to work with him, many made excuses to avoid being paired with the blind kid who needed extra explanations and couldn't read the measurement scales on the equipment. "Charles," Mrs. Chen, the chemistry teacher, called out, "You'll be working with Sarah today." Sarah Williams was new to Jefferson High, having transferred in just a month ago. Charles had never worked with her before and braced himself for the usual awkward interaction. "Hi." Sarah's voice was surprisingly warm as she settled beside him. "I'm Sarah. How do you want to handle this experiment?" The simple question, "How do you want to handle this?" was so unexpected that Charles found himself momentarily speechless. Most partners either took over completely or waited for him to explain how to accommodate his blindness. "I can handle the measurements if you can read them to me," he finally offered. "I'm good with precise movements, just not with seeing the scales." "Perfect," Sarah replied, and Charles could hear the smile in her voice. "I'm terrible with careful procedures, but great at reading numbers. We'll make a good team." For the first time that day, Charles felt himself relax slightly. They worked well together, Sarah describing everything clearly without being condescending, Charles executing the procedures with practiced precision. When they finished the experiment successfully, her quiet "we did it" seemed to include him fully in the achievement. But the moment of normalcy was shattered as they left the classroom. Charles heard the whispers before Sarah did. "Look at her, pretending he's normal." "She'll learn soon enough." Probably feel sorry for him. Sarah's footsteps faltered beside him, and Charles felt his heart sink. He had experienced this before, people who were initially kind, gradually pulling away as social pressure mounted. He wouldn't blame her if she did the same. But Sarah surprised him again. "Hey," she said, her voice carrying clearly down the hallway. "Anyone who has nothing better to do than mock someone else's differences clearly needs to work on themselves first." The whispers died away, replaced by embarrassed shuffling. Charles felt a rush of gratitude, but also worry for his unexpected defender. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly as they walked toward the school exit. "They'll turn on you too." "Let them try," Sarah replied firmly. "My sister is deaf. I learned a long time ago that people's attitudes toward differences say more about them than about the person they're judging." As Charles made his way home that afternoon, his cane tapping out a rhythm on the sidewalk, he reflected on the day's events. The cruelty was nothing new. He had faced it for years and would likely face it for years to come. But Sarah's simple act of kindness, her matter-of-fact acceptance, had shown him something important. Not everyone saw his blindness as his defining characteristic. At home, his mother noticed his thoughtful mood. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked, as he sat at the kitchen counter, homework spread out before him. "Just thinking," he replied, his fingers moving over his Braille textbook. "Mum, do you think things will ever change? Will people ever see past the blindness?" Elena Bolivar was quiet for a moment, and Charles could hear her putting down the dish she had been drying. Her footsteps approached, and then her arms were around him, holding him close like she used to when he was small. "Some already do," she said softly. "And those are the people worth knowing. The others, their blindness is worse than yours, Charles. They're blind in their hearts, and that's a harder condition to cure." That night, as Charles lay in bed, he thought about Sarah's words and his mother's embrace. The world could be cruel, yes, but there were moments of kindness too. The challenge was learning to hold on to those moments when the darkness, both physical and emotional, threatened to overwhelm him. He thought about Drake and his followers, about the whispers and taunts, about the daily challenges of navigating not just physical spaces, but social ones as well. But he also thought about Miss Peterson's quiet support, Mr. Harrison's intervention, and Sarah's unexpected friendship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, and possibly new cruelties. But it might also bring new allies, new understanding, and new opportunities to show that his value as a person wasn't diminished by his inability to see. As he drifted off to sleep, Charles remembered something his grandmother had told him years ago. "The world can be hard, my dear, but it can also be beautiful. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones you can't see with your eyes." He didn't know then how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that his greatest test and his greatest joy was still to come. But for now, he held on to the knowledge that not everyone saw his blindness as a tragedy, and that perhaps somewhere in this often cruel world there were people who would see him for who he truly was. The day's events had left their mark, but they had also strengthened his resolve. He would continue to face each day with dignity, each challenge with determination, and each moment of kindness with gratitude. Because sometimes, in the midst of darkness, the smallest light can show the way forward. As sleep finally claimed him, Charles's last conscious thought was a hope, not that he would suddenly be able to see, but that someday someone would look at him and see not the blind boy, not the tragedy, but simply Charles Bolivar, a person worthy of love and respect, regardless of what his eyes could or couldn't do. Little did he know that such a person was closer than he imagined, and that the cruelty he had endured would soon be balanced by a love so pure and selfless that it would change not only his life, but his entire understanding of what it meant to truly see. A divine intervention. Autumn had painted the campus of Riverside Community College in colors Charles Bolivar could only imagine. Though he couldn't see the changing leaves or the way the October sun cast long shadows across the quad, he could feel the crisp air on his face and hear the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his feet as he made his way to his morning classes. At 19, Charles had grown into his features, his childhood beauty maturing into a striking handsomeness that drew whispers and stares he couldn't see. His dark hair, now styled in casual waves, framed a face that seemed carved from marble, high cheekbones, strong jaw, and those unseeing hazel eyes that somehow managed to appear both vulnerable and intense. College had promised a fresh start, a place where his academic achievements might finally overshadow his disability. In many ways, it had delivered. Professors treated him with professional respect rather than pity, and the Disability Services Office provided support without making him feel like a burden. But some things remained painfully familiar. That particular October morning started like any other. Charles had mastered the layout of the campus over the past 2 months, his white cane sweeping confidently as he navigated the familiar path from the bus stop to his first class. The sound of other students' conversations washed over him like background music. Discussions about upcoming exams, weekend plans, and the latest campus gossip. "Did you see that blind guy in Professor Martinez's class?" he heard a female voice say as he passed. "The one who looks like he should be on a magazine cover?" "Yeah," another voice replied. "Such a waste, right? Like putting a Ferrari engine in a car with no wheels." Charles had learned to let such comments roll off him like water, though each one left a small mark on his soul. He focused instead on the rhythm of his cane, the mental map of his route, and the knowledge that his first class of the day was English literature, his favorite subject. The morning passed without incident, but it was during the lunch break that everything changed. Charles had found a quiet spot near the Humanities building where he could eat his packed lunch in peace, away from the crowded cafeteria. He had just finished his sandwich when he heard them approaching, a group of male students whose voices he had learned to avoid. "Well, if it isn't our favorite blind genius," called out Jason Turner, his voice carrying that false friendliness that Charles had learned to dread. "All alone again?" Charles remained silent, carefully packing away his lunch containers. He had dealt with Jason and his friends before. They were the type who saw his disability as both an affront and an entertainment opportunity. "Hey, we're talking to you," another voice chimed in. Mike Stevens, Jason's usual sidekick. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore people? Oh, wait, maybe you can't hear either." "I hear you fine," Charles replied calmly, standing to leave. "I just have nothing to say." "Oh, he has nothing to say," Jason mocked. "Maybe he'd have something to say if we helped him find his way around campus. What do you think, guys? Should we give him a tour?" Charles felt his cane being yanked from his grip, the familiar extension of his arm suddenly gone. His heart rate spiked, but he kept his face neutral. Showing fear would only encourage them. "Give it back," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the panic building in his chest. "Give what back?" Jason taunted, and Charles could hear the cane being passed around the group. "Oh, you mean this stick? Come on, man, you're in college now. Time to learn to walk on your own." Charles stood perfectly still, knowing that moving without his cane in an open space could be dangerous. His other senses were heightened. He could hear the group moving around him, their laughter echoing off the building walls, the rustle of their clothes as they passed his cane back and forth. Then, cutting through the cruel laughter like a thunderbolt, came a voice he had never heard before, strong, clear, and filled with righteous anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The laughter stopped abruptly. Charles heard quick footsteps approaching, the click of boots on concrete, and sensed a new presence inserting itself between him and his tormentors. "Mind your own business, black girl," Jason sneered, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. "His business is my business," the newcomer replied, her voice unwavering. "And right now, my business is making sure you understand exactly how pathetic you look, picking on someone because of a disability. Give me that cane, now." There was something in her voice, a mixture of authority and barely contained fury, that seemed to pierce through the bully's bravado. Charles heard a shuffle of movement, then the sound of his cane being handed over. "This isn't over," Jason muttered, but his threat sounded hollow. "Oh, it's definitely over," the woman replied. "Unless you want me to start listing the college's policies on harassment and discrimination, I'm sure the dean would be very interested in hearing about this little incident." Footsteps retreated quickly, the sound of muttered curses fading into the distance. Charles stood still, processing what had just happened, when he felt a gentle touch on his arm. "Here's your cane," the voice said, softer now but still strong. "I'm Josephine Devine, but most people call me Joe. Are you okay?" Charles wrapped his fingers around the familiar handle of his cane, feeling grounded again. "Charles Bolivar," he replied, turning toward her voice. "And yes, I'm okay. Thank you. Not many people would have stepped in like that." "Not many people have the sense God gave a goose," Josephine replied, and Charles could hear the smile in her voice. Those guys are nothing but oversized kindergartners with ego problems. Her frankness startled a laugh out of him, a genuine laugh, something rare in situations like these. That's one way to put it. It's the nice way to put it. I had some other descriptions in mind, Josephine said. Listen, I've seen those guys around before. They won't bother you again. I'll make sure of it. There was something about her voice, a warmth and strength that seemed to wrap around him like a protective blanket. Charles found himself wanting to know more about this unexpected defender. You don't have to do that, he said. I don't want you getting into trouble on my account. Trouble? Josephine laughed, and the sound was like music. Honey, I've been handling bullies since grade school. Sometimes angels wear combat boots, and today these boots are on patrol. The way she spoke, confident but not condescending, protective but not pitying, was unlike anything Charles had experienced before. Most people who helped him either treated him like a charity case or expected endless gratitude. Josephine seemed to treat standing up to bullies as simply the right thing to do, no more remarkable than helping someone pick up dropped books. "Can I buy you a coffee?" Charles found himself asking, "to thank you properly." "Only if you let me buy you one too," Josephine replied. "The campus cafe makes a mean caramel latte, and I have a feeling you might be interesting to talk to." As they walked to the cafe, Charles discovered that Josephine was naturally descriptive in her speech, painting pictures with her words without being asked. She warned him about upcoming steps, described the cafe's layout, and guided him to a table with a gentle touch that somehow managed to be both helpful and respectful of his independence. "So, Charles Bolivar," she said once they were seated with their drinks, "tell me about yourself. What brings you to Riverside?" For the next hour, they talked. Charles found himself sharing things he rarely discussed: his love of music, his struggles with family expectations, his dreams of becoming a counselor for other disabled students. Josephine listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly engaging with his words rather than just being polite. In turn, she shared pieces of herself. She was a scholarship student, working part-time to cover expenses not covered by financial aid. She was studying social work, driven by a desire to help others that stemmed from her own complicated past. "Life hasn't always been kind," she said, "but that's just more reason to be kind ourselves, right?" As they talked, Charles began to form a picture of Josephine in his mind. Not her physical appearance, which meant little to him, but the essence of her. She was strong but gentle, fierce but compassionate, confident but humble. Her voice carried a hint of something that spoke of past pain, but also of resilience and joy. The afternoon slipped away as they talked, and when Josephine finally said she had to leave for her next class, Charles felt a strange reluctance to end their conversation. "Will I see you around campus?" he asked, then smiled at his own choice of words. "Well, you know what I mean." "Count on it," Josephine replied. "Someone's got to keep those knuckleheads in line, and it might as well be me." As Charles made his way home that evening, he found himself replaying their conversation in his mind. There had been something different about this interaction, something that went beyond gratitude for her intervention with the bullies. That night, as he sat at his piano, his fingers moved across the keys in a new melody. Something hopeful and strong, like Josephine's voice. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen, not as the blind student, not as an object of pity or curiosity, but as himself. His mother noticed his improved mood at dinner. "Something good happened today?" she asked. Charles considered the question. "I met someone," he said finally. "Someone who sees people for who they are, not what they can or can't do." "Sounds like a special person," his mother replied, and Charles could hear the smile in her voice. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think she might be." As he lay in bed that night, Charles thought about how one moment, one person, could change the course of a day, perhaps even the course of a life. He thought about Josephine's voice, strong and clear, cutting through the darkness of cruelty. He thought about her laugh, her straightforward manner, her natural ability to help without hovering. He didn't know then that this was just the beginning, that Josephine Devine would become more than just a defender or a friend. He couldn't have known that her intervention that day would set in motion a chain of events that would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. For now, he simply smiled in the darkness, feeling for the first time in a long while that perhaps the world wasn't as cold as it sometimes seemed. Sometimes, he realized, the cruelest moments could lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Sometimes, divine intervention came not in the form of miracles, but in the shape of a fierce-hearted woman with combat boots and a voice that could shake the stars. As sleep claimed him, Charles held on to the memory of Josephine's voice, strong and sure, standing up against injustice. In his dreams, he saw not with his eyes but with his heart, and in that vision, the world seemed a little brighter, a little warmer, a little more full of possibility. Little did he know that this was just the first chapter of a story that would redefine everything he thought he knew about sight, about love, and about the true meaning of seeing with the heart. The beginning of a beautiful friendship. The weeks following their first meeting unfurled like a gentle spring bloom, each day bringing new depths to the connection between Charles and Josephine. October mellowed into November, and the campus grounds became a carpet of crackling leaves that announced every footstep, a natural radar system that Charles had learned to appreciate. Their daily meetings had become as natural as breathing. Every morning, Josephine would wait at the bus stop where Charles arrived, her voice carrying across the morning air like a beacon guiding him home. "Over here, Charles," she would call, and he would smile, already turning toward the sound before she spoke. He had memorized the rhythm of her footsteps, the subtle scent of vanilla and coffee that seemed to follow her everywhere, the way her voice changed when she smiled. All these things creating a picture more vivid than any visual image could be. One particularly crisp morning, as they walked to their first classes, Josephine was describing the sunrise she'd witnessed on her way to campus. "The sky looked like it was on fire," she said, her voice painting pictures in Charles's mind. "All orange and pink, with these streaks of purple that reminded me of brush strokes. And there was this one cloud that looked exactly like a dragon." She stopped suddenly, and Charles could hear the embarrassment in her voice. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't—" "Please don't stop," Charles said quietly, his hand finding her arm. "The way you describe things, it's like I can see them too. Different from how others see, maybe, but just as real." Josephine was quiet for a moment, then squeezed his hand. "You know what's funny? Since I met you, I've started seeing things differently myself. It's like I notice details I never did before, trying to figure out how to describe them to you." This was what made Josephine special, Charles realized. She didn't tiptoe around his blindness or treat it like a tragedy. Instead, she had found a way to share her world with him that made both their experiences richer. Their friendship grew in small moments, quiet conversations between classes, shared lunches in what had become their spot near the Humanities building. Josephine would bring homemade cookies or sandwiches to share, describing each ingredient as they ate. "Today's special is turkey and avocado," she announced one afternoon, "with this amazing honey mustard sauce I discovered. The bread is still warm. Here, feel it." She guided his hand to the sandwich, letting him experience the texture and warmth for himself, rather than just telling him about it. It was these small gestures of understanding that made Charles feel truly seen. As they spent more time together, Charles learned about Josephine's life in pieces, each revelation making him understand better the strength that lay beneath her cheerful exterior. She told him about losing her parents in a car accident when she was young, about growing up with an aunt who saw her more as a burden than a blessing. Aunt Martha had this way of making every kindness feel like a sacrifice, Josephine explained one day, her voice carrying an echo of old pain. Even the smallest things, school supplies, new shoes when I'd outgrown the old ones, came with reminders of how much she was giving up for me. Charles listened, understanding all too well the weight of being seen as a burden. "How did you stay so kind?" he asked. After all that? Josephine was quiet for a moment, and Charles could hear her fingers tapping thoughtfully on her coffee cup. "I decided early on that I had two choices," she finally said. "I could become like her, seeing the world as a place of scarcity and sacrifice, or I could be different. I chose different." These conversations deepened their connection, building a foundation of understanding that went beyond simple friendship. Charles found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone else, his secret fears, his dreams, the lonely nights when his blindness felt like an insurmountable wall between him and the rest of the world. One rainy afternoon, as they sat in the campus library, Charles told her about his struggles with his family's well-meaning but often painful attempts to help. "They try so hard," he explained, his fingers tracing the patterns of the wooden table, "but sometimes their trying just makes me feel more different, more broken." "You're not broken," Josephine said firmly, her hand covering his. "Different isn't broken, it's just different." The warmth of her hand on his, the conviction in her voice, these things anchored him, made him feel whole in a way he hadn't before. Their friendship didn't go unnoticed on campus. Charles could hear the whispers, the speculation about the beautiful blind guy and the black girl who seemed inseparable. Some were kind, others less so, but neither Charles nor Josephine paid them any mind. "Let them talk," Josephine would say with a laugh. "They're just jealous because we have more fun than they do." And they did have fun. Josephine had a way of making ordinary moments extraordinary. She would describe movies in such detail that Charles felt like he was there, adding sound effects and different voices for characters that made him laugh until his sides hurt. She introduced him to new music, guiding his hands over her old record player, letting him feel the vibrations of the bass and the subtle patterns in the album covers. In return, he shared his love of classical music, playing pieces on the piano in the music room while describing how each composition made him feel. One memorable afternoon, Josephine convinced him to try dancing. "Everyone can dance," she insisted, taking his hands. "It's about feeling the music, not seeing the steps." At first Charles was hesitant, afraid of looking foolish, but Josephine's patience and gentle guidance helped him find his rhythm. Soon they were swaying to the music, laughing as they occasionally stumbled. "See," she said, her voice close to his ear, "you're a natural." As autumn progressed, they developed their own routines and rituals. Every Wednesday they would get coffee from the campus cafe and walk to the small park nearby, where Josephine would read aloud from whatever book they were discussing in their shared literature class. "Your voice brings the words to life," Charles told her one day. "It's like hearing colors." Josephine laughed softly. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my reading voice. Most people just tell me I get too excited about the stories." "You do," Charles smiled. "That's what makes it perfect." Their friendship wasn't just about the big moments or deep conversations. It was built on countless small kindnesses, tiny gestures that showed how well they understood each other. Josephine learned to warn Charles about approaching obstacles without making it obvious to others, a casual touch on his arm, or a well-timed comment that helped him navigate without drawing attention to his blindness. Charles, in turn, became attuned to the subtle changes in Josephine's voice that told him when she was tired or stressed, even when she tried to hide it. He learned when to offer a listening ear and when to simply sit in comfortable silence, letting her find her own words. One particularly difficult day, after Josephine had received a harsh phone call from her aunt, Charles played the piano for her in the empty music room. His fingers found the keys instinctively, weaving together melodies that spoke of understanding and comfort when words seemed inadequate. "How do you do that?" Josephine asked when he finished, her voice thick with emotion. "How do you know exactly what my heart needs to hear?" "Maybe because I listen with mine," Charles replied softly. Their connection deepened through shared challenges as well. When final exams approached, they created a study system that worked for both of them. Josephine would read the material aloud while Charles listened, his fingers moving over his braille notes. Then they would discuss the concepts, each bringing their unique perspective to the subject matter. "You make me see things differently," Josephine told him during one of their study sessions. "It's like you notice things in the text that I completely missed because I was too busy looking at the obvious. And you help me understand things I might have missed because I couldn't see the visual clues," Charles responded. "We make a good team." As the semester progressed, Charles found himself increasingly aware of Josephine's presence, not just physically but emotionally. The sound of her voice could lift his spirits on the darkest days. Her laugh had become his favorite melody, her touch on his arm sending warmth through his entire being. One evening, as they sat on a bench outside the library, Josephine described the sunset to him in such vivid detail that he could almost see it. As she spoke, Charles realized something profound. He might not be able to see the world with his eyes, but through Josephine, he was learning to see it with his heart. "The clouds are like silk scarves," she was saying, "all pink and gold around the edges, and there's this one star just starting to peek through like it's shy about joining the show." Charles listened, not just to her words, but to the passion in her voice, the way she could find beauty in everything around them and share it with him in a way that made it real, tangible, alive. Their friendship had become something precious and rare, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries of sight and perception. Josephine wasn't just his friend. She had become his window to the world, helping him experience life in new and beautiful ways. But even then, as their bond grew stronger with each passing day, neither Charles nor Josephine realized that their friendship was slowly transforming into something deeper, something that would eventually change both their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. As November drew to a close, bringing with it the promise of winter and new beginnings, Charles found himself thinking more and more about Josephine, about her kindness, her strength, her ability to make him feel completely and utterly himself. He didn't know yet that these thoughts were the first stirrings of love, or that the warmth he felt in her presence was more than just friendship. For now, he was content in the knowledge that he had found someone who saw him for who he truly was. Not as the blind student, not as a person to be pitied or helped, but as Charles Bolivar, a young man with dreams, fears, talents, and possibilities. And Josephine, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself yet, was beginning to see Charles as more than just a friend to protect and support. She was starting to understand that sometimes the heart sees what the eyes cannot, and that the most beautiful connections are often the ones that develop slowly, naturally, like flowers turning toward the sun. As they parted ways that evening, their goodbye held a hint of reluctance, as if neither wanted to break the spell of their time together. "Same time tomorrow?" Josephine asked, her voice carrying a smile. "Wouldn't miss it," Charles replied, his heart warming at the thought of another day in her company. Little did they know that their beautiful friendship was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would test their bond, challenge their perceptions, and ultimately teach them both what it truly means to see with the heart. As Charles made his way home that night, the memory of Josephine's voice echoing in his mind, he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. In a world that had often seemed dark and unwelcoming, he had found a light, not one that he could see with his eyes, but one that illuminated his world nonetheless. The beautiful friendship that had begun on that autumn day was growing into something neither of them could have predicted, something that would eventually prove stronger than sight itself. But for now, it was enough to know that tomorrow would bring another day together, another chance to share their worlds, another opportunity to see life through each other's hearts. Guardian Angel in Action Winter had settled over Riverside Community College, bringing with it shorter days and longer nights. For Charles, the changing season meant adapting to new challenges. Slippery walkways, the muffled echo of footsteps in snow, and the way cold air seemed to alter the acoustic landscape he relied upon to navigate his world. But this winter was different from any he had experienced before, because now he had Josephine. It began with the little things. One frosty morning in early December, Josephine appeared at their usual meeting spot with an extra pair of gloves. "These are specially lined," she explained, pressing them into his hands. "I noticed you have trouble feeling your cane when your hands get too cold. These should help you maintain better grip while keeping your fingers warm." Charles ran his fingers over the soft material, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. She hadn't just noticed his struggle. She had found a practical solution that preserved his independence while addressing the problem. "How did you know?" he asked, slipping the gloves on. "I pay attention," Josephine replied simply. "That's what friends do." But it wasn't just the practical help that made Josephine special. She had an innate understanding of when Charles needed support and when he needed space to handle things on his own. One particularly challenging day in their advanced literature class demonstrated this perfectly. The class was discussing visual symbolism in poetry, and the professor had brought in prints of famous paintings to illustrate his points. As other students exclaimed over the images, Charles felt the familiar weight of exclusion settling over him. Without drawing attention to the situation, Josephine quietly began describing each painting in whispered detail, her voice carrying only to his ears. But she didn't just describe the obvious. She captured the emotion, the meaning, the deeper significance of each work. "This one," she murmured as the professor held up Starry Night. "It's like what music would look like if you could see it. The sky is dancing, Charles. The stars aren't just points of light. They're whirling, spinning, like notes jumping off a musical staff." Her descriptions transformed what could have been a moment of isolation into an opportunity for deeper understanding. Charles found himself contributing to the class discussion with insights that even the professor hadn't considered, drawing parallels between the visual symbolism and the way music could convey similar themes. After class, several students approached them, curious about their collaborative approach. "The way you two work together," one classmate commented. "It's like you share a brain or something." Josephine laughed. "More like we share different ways of seeing the same thing. Sometimes you need more than one perspective to get the full picture." Their partnership extended beyond the classroom. When Charles mentioned his desire to join the college choir, but hesitated because of the sheet music challenge, Josephine sprang into action. She spent hours working with the music department to find a solution, eventually helping to create a system where Charles could learn his parts through a combination of audio recordings and Braille music notation. The first choir practice was nerve-wracking for Charles, but Josephine was there, her presence a steady anchor in the sea of new voices and unfamiliar routines. She had positioned herself where he could easily hear her voice, helping him stay on pitch without making it obvious she was doing so. "You have a beautiful voice," she told him afterward, genuine admiration in her tone. "When you sing, it's like you're sharing a piece of your soul." These moments of understanding and support accumulated day by day, building a foundation of trust and comfort between them. Josephine seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate Charles's needs without making him feel dependent. One memorable incident occurred during a campus-wide power outage. While other students panicked in the sudden darkness, Josephine remained calm, understanding that for Charles, this was just another day. "Looks like everyone else gets to experience your world for a while," she commented, her voice carrying a smile. "Want to show them how it's done?" Together, they helped guide their classmates through the darkened hallways, Charles navigating confidently with his cane, while Josephine provided verbal directions. It became a powerful moment of role reversal, where Charles's disability transformed into an advantage. "You're a natural leader," Josephine observed afterward. "You just needed the right circumstances for others to see it." Their collaboration extended to creative projects as well. When their literature professor assigned a presentation on sensory imagery in poetry, Josephine suggested an unconventional approach. They created a multimedia presentation where Charles played original piano compositions inspired by famous poems, while Josephine read the verses. "The music helps people understand the emotional landscape of the words," she explained during their practice sessions. "And you're playing. It's like you're translating the poetry into a language everyone can feel." The presentation was a triumph, earning them not just an A, but also a standing ovation from their classmates. More importantly, it showed everyone that disability didn't have to be a limitation. It could be a source of unique perspective and creativity. Through all these experiences, Josephine never treated Charles's blindness as something to be overcome or pitied. Instead, she approached each challenge as an opportunity to find creative solutions together. When Charles struggled with a particularly complex chemistry experiment, Josephine didn't take over or suggest he skip it. Instead, she worked with him to develop a system of verbal cues and tactile markers that allowed him to perform the experiment independently. "You're not just helping me," Charles told her one day as they celebrated another successful lab session. "You're teaching me to help myself." "That's because I know you can do anything," Josephine replied. "Sometimes you just need someone to believe in you until you believe it yourself." Their friendship became a topic of discussion among other students, but not always in the way people expected. Rather than focusing on Charles's disability or their different backgrounds, their peers began to notice the seamless way they worked together, the natural rhythm they had developed. "It's like watching a dance," one of their classmates observed. "You both just know exactly where the other person needs you to be." Winter brought new opportunities for Josephine to demonstrate her guardian angel status. During a particularly heavy snowfall, she arrived at Charles's home early, having walked through the storm to ensure he would have safe guidance to the bus stop. "You didn't have to do that," Charles protested, touched by her dedication. "I know I didn't have to," Josephine replied, stamping snow from her boots. "I wanted to, besides. What kind of guardian angel would I be if I let a little blizzard stop me?" Her support wasn't limited to physical assistance. When Charles received news that his younger brother had been accepted to a prestigious art school, bringing up complicated feelings about his own limitations, Josephine knew exactly what to say. "Your brother sees the world with his eyes," she told him, sitting beside him in their favorite spot in the music room. "You see it with your heart and your hands and your incredible mind. Both ways of seeing are valid, both are beautiful, and both have the power to create something meaningful." One particularly meaningful moment came during the college's Winter Arts Festival. The music department had invited Charles to perform a piano piece, but he was hesitant about navigating the unfamiliar stage setup. Josephine spent hours with him after classes, helping him memorize the layout of the stage, counting steps, and creating reference points he could use to orient himself. But her most significant contribution came just before his performance. "Close your eyes," she whispered to the audience as Charles settled at the piano. Listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. Try to see the music the way Charles does, not as notes on a page, but as emotions given voice. The performance was transformative. Charles played with a passion and sensitivity that moved many in the audience to tears, and Josephine's introduction had helped them experience the music in a new way. As winter deepened, their bond continued to grow stronger. Josephine's support wasn't just about helping Charles navigate the physical world, it was about helping him discover and embrace his own potential. She encouraged him to share his original compositions with the music department, leading to an opportunity to score the spring theatre production. She pushed him to join class discussions, knowing his unique perspective would enrich the conversation. And she celebrated every victory, no matter how small, with genuine enthusiasm. "You're my miracle," Charles told her one snowy afternoon as they sat in the campus coffee shop, warm drinks providing a shield against the winter chill. "No," Josephine corrected gently, "I'm just the person lucky enough to see the miracles you create every day." Their friendship had become a testament to the power of understanding and acceptance. Josephine's role as guardian angel wasn't about protection or pity, it was about partnership, about seeing possibilities where others saw limitations, about believing in the power of human connection to overcome any obstacle. As the winter term drew to a close, Charles realized how much his life had changed since Josephine had entered it. She hadn't just helped him navigate the physical challenges of being blind in a sighted world, she had helped him see himself in a new light. One evening, as they worked late in the music room, Charles played a new composition he had written. The piece was different from his usual style, filled with hope and joy, rather than the melancholy that had often characterized his earlier work. "This one's about you," he said softly as the last notes faded away, "about how you helped me see the world in colors I never knew existed." Josephine was quiet for a long moment, and Charles could hear the subtle sound of her wiping away tears. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. What neither of them realized yet was that this period of friendship, of guardian angel and protected soul, was laying the groundwork for something even more profound. The trust they built, the understanding they shared, the joy they found in each other's company. All of these things were creating a foundation for a love story that would transform both their lives. As winter began to fade into early spring, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, Charles and Josephine continued their daily routine of shared classes, study sessions, and musical interludes. But something was shifting, subtle as a change in the wind, profound as the turning of seasons. In the quiet moments between words, in the gentle touches that guided and supported, in the laughter that came more easily with each passing day, love was beginning to bloom. Like the first flowers pushing through the winter snow, it was tender and uncertain, but undeniably real. Little did they know that their story was about to enter a new chapter, one that would test their bond in ways they couldn't imagine. But for now, they simply enjoyed each other's company. Guardian angel and cherished friend. Two souls discovering that sometimes the deepest connections are formed not through sight, but through the silent language of the heart. Their evolving relationship was like a carefully crafted symphony, each moment of understanding, each act of kindness, each shared laugh, adding new notes to their unique melody. And as winter released its grip on the world around them, the warmth between them continued to grow, promising something even more beautiful to come. That night, neither Charles nor Josephine could sleep, their hearts too full of joy and possibility. In his room, Charles sat at his piano until the early hours of the morning, his fingers dancing across the keys as he composed a piece that would later become known as Love's Vision, a melody that captured the euphoria of their shared confession. Meanwhile, in her small apartment across town, Josephine sat by her window, watching the stars and thinking about how Charles had changed her understanding of what it meant to truly see. She wrote in her journal, "Today, love opened my eyes in a way I never expected. Charles sees me, really sees me, in a way no one else ever has. He doesn't just see the surface, he sees straight to my soul. How ironic that it took a blind man to teach me what it really means to see clearly." The next morning they met at their usual spot, but everything felt new, as if the world had shifted on its axis. The simple act of holding hands, something they'd done countless times before as friends, now carried a different weight, a deeper meaning. "Good morning," Charles said softly as he heard her approach, his face breaking into a radiant smile. "Good morning," Josephine replied, and he could hear the joy bubbling in her voice. "I brought you something." She pressed a small object into his hands. Charles ran his fingers over it, feeling the smooth surface and intricate patterns. "What is it?" "It's a heart-shaped stone I found on the beach last summer," Josephine explained. "I've been carrying it in my pocket ever since, thinking about giving it to you. It reminded me of you, how something can be both strong and beautiful, shaped by time and experience into something perfect." Charles traced the heart shape again, marveling at how the stone felt warm from being in her pocket. "It's perfect," he whispered. As they walked to their first class, they talked about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing naturally despite the momentous change in their relationship. Other students noticed the difference in them, the way they seemed to glow from within, the tender way they interacted, the pure joy that radiated from both of them. "You two finally figured it out, huh?" Sarah, their friend from chemistry class, commented with a knowing smile in her voice. "Was it that obvious?" Josephine asked, laughing. "Only to everyone except you two," Sarah replied. "We've been watching you fall in love for months." The day passed in a blur of shared moments and tender discoveries. During lunch, they returned to their spot in the garden, where Charles pulled out his phone and played the piece he'd composed the night before. "This is what loving you feels like," he explained as the melody filled the air around them. "Each note is a different aspect of you, your laugh, your kindness, your strength, your gentle heart." Josephine listened in silence, tears rolling down her cheeks as the music painted their love story in sounds. When it ended, she took his face in her hands and kissed him softly. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she whispered against his lips. As afternoon classes began, they reluctantly separated, but their connection remained strong. In literature class, they passed notes in Braille. Charles had been teaching Josephine the basics, and she'd practiced for weeks to be able to write simple messages he could read. His fingers traced her wobbly but earnest attempts at Braille lettering. "I love you." The professor, noticing their distraction but also their obvious joy, simply smiled and continued the lecture. After all, wasn't poetry about love and beauty? And what could be more poetic than two souls finding each other against all odds? After classes ended, they decided to take a walk around the campus lake. The spring air was warm, filled with the scent of flowers and new grass. Josephine described everything she saw, but now her descriptions were punctuated with gentle kisses and loving touches. "The sunset is turning the lake to gold," she murmured, standing behind Charles with her arms wrapped around his waist. "The light is catching your hair, making it look like a halo. You're so beautiful, Charles." "Not as beautiful as your heart," he replied, turning in her arms to face her. "You know, I used to dream about what love would feel like. I imagined it would be like music, something you can feel in your soul, even if you can't see it. But this, loving you, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." As evening approached, they sat on a bench near the lake, planning their first official date. Charles wanted to cook for her. He was an excellent cook, having learned to navigate the kitchen by touch and smell. Josephine insisted on bringing dessert, promising to make her grandmother's famous chocolate cake. "Saturday evening, then?" Charles asked, his heart racing with anticipation. "Saturday evening," Josephine confirmed. "I can't wait." As they prepared to part for the day, both felt the reluctance in their movements, the desire to stretch these precious moments as long as possible. Charles reached out, his fingers finding Josephine's face with practiced ease, tracing the smile he could feel beneath his touch. "I love you," he said softly, still marveling at how natural those words felt now. "Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me." "I love you too," Josephine replied, leaning into his touch. "Thank you for teaching me what it really means to see with the heart." Their goodbye kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise for all the tomorrows they would share. As Charles heard Josephine's footsteps fade into the distance, he touched the heart-shaped stone in his pocket and smiled. His world, once limited by his blindness, had expanded infinitely through love. That night, as he lay in bed, Charles reflected on how much his life had changed since meeting Josephine. She hadn't just become his eyes to the world, she had become his heart's compass, guiding him toward a love he never thought possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adventures, but for now, he was content in the knowledge that he had found something rare and precious, a love that saw beyond physical sight to the truth of the soul within. As sleep finally claimed him, Charles dreamed of colors he'd never seen, painted by the sound of Josephine's voice and the touch of her hand. In his dreams, love had a color all its own, warm like sunshine, soft like flower petals, and as boundless as the sky she so often described to him. Little did they know that their love would soon be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. But for now, in the sweet aftermath of their confession, everything seemed possible. After all, when you see with your heart, even the darkest night contains the promise of dawn. And so ended the day that changed everything, the day when two hearts spoke their truth, when love opened eyes that had never needed sight to see what truly mattered. It was just the beginning of their story, but it was a beginning filled with promise, hope, and the kind of love that lights up the darkness and shows the way home. As the stars wheeled overhead and the spring night wrapped the world in gentle darkness, two hearts beat in perfect synchronization, separated by distance, but united by a love that transcended all boundaries, even the boundary between sight and blindness. Their story was just beginning, and the best chapters were yet to be written. The weight of the past. The revelation of Josephine's past came on a quiet Sunday evening, 3 weeks after she and Charles had confessed their love. They were sitting in Charles's small apartment, where he had just finished playing a new composition on his piano. The music had stirred something deep within Josephine, bringing to the surface memories she had long tried to keep buried. "That melody," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight Charles had never heard before. "It reminds me of something my mother used to hum while she worked in the garden. I haven't thought about that in years." Charles turned toward her voice, sensing the change in her tone. "Tell me about her," he said gently, reaching out to find her hand. "You've never really talked about your parents." There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of rain beginning to tap against the windows. When Josephine finally spoke, her voice was thick with unshed tears. "I was 8 years old," she began, "when it happened. It was raining, just like tonight. My parents were driving home from a dinner party. They'd left me with a neighbor because I had a cold." She squeezed Charles's hand tightly. The roads were slick, and another driver ran a red light. Charles listened in silence as Josephine's story unfolded. each word carrying years of pain and loss. He could hear the tears in her voice, feel the slight trembling of her hand in his, sense the way her body tensed with remembered grief. "The police came to the neighbor's house at midnight," she continued. "I remember standing in my pajamas, clutching my stuffed rabbit, not understanding why Mrs. Peterson was crying as she packed my overnight bag. I kept asking when Mommy and Daddy were coming to get me." The rain outside grew heavier, providing a somber backdrop to Josephine's story. Charles pulled her closer, offering silent support as she found the courage to continue. "They took me to Aunt Martha's house the next day. She was my mother's older sister, the only relative who could take me in. I remember walking into her house, still wearing my pajamas from the night before, still not really understanding what was happening." Josephine's voice cracked as she described her aunt's cold reception. "The first thing she said to me wasn't, 'I'm sorry,' or 'everything will be okay.' It was, 'Don't touch anything, I just cleaned.'" Charles felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of an 8-year-old Josephine, grieving and confused, being met with such coldness. But he remained silent, knowing she needed to tell her story without interruption. "The basement became my room," Josephine continued. "Aunt Martha said it was because the upstairs bedrooms were full of her things, but I know now it was because she wanted to keep me out of sight, out of mind, like having me there was a constant reminder of the sister she'd lost." She described the basement room in detail, the cold concrete floors, the small window near the ceiling that let in just enough light to remind her of what she was missing, the musty smell that never quite went away. Charles felt his heart breaking as he imagined little Josephine trying to make a home in such a place. "I had this little ritual," she said, her voice softening with the memory. "Every night I would drag my mattress under that high window and look up at the stars. I'd pretend my parents could see the same stars, that somehow we were still connected. I'd tell them about my day, about how much I missed them, about how I was trying to be brave." The tears were flowing freely now, and Charles could feel them dropping onto their joined hands. He reached up with his free hand to gently wipe them away, his touch full of tenderness. "Aunt Martha." Josephine's voice hardened slightly. "She made sure I had food and clothes and went to school, but that was it. There were no hugs, no words of comfort, no attempt to help me process my grief. She treated me like an unwanted obligation, a burden she'd been forced to bear." She described the years that followed, the constant criticism, the subtle and not-so-subtle reminders that she was dependent on her aunt's charity, the way every achievement was dismissed or diminished. If I got an A on a test, she'd say, "Well, I suppose you had nothing else to do but study." If I helped with housework, it was, "The least you can do for all I've given you." Nothing was ever enough. Charles listened as Josephine recounted countless small cruelties, being made to eat alone in the kitchen while her aunt entertained guests in the dining room, having to wear second-hand clothes while her aunt bought herself new outfits, being told repeatedly that she was just like her mother, in a tone that made it clear this wasn't a compliment. The worst part, Josephine said, her voice barely above a whisper, was when she would have her bridge club over. They would talk about me, as if I wasn't there, discussing what a burden I must be, how noble my aunt was for taking in her dead sister's child. "Such a shame," they would say, "and now Martha has to raise her." She described one particularly painful memory from her 13th birthday. "I had saved up my allowance to buy ingredients to bake a cake, thinking maybe we could celebrate together. When Aunt Martha saw what I was doing, she said, 'Don't waste my flour. It's not like you have anyone to share it with anyway.'" Charles felt tears rolling down his own cheeks now, his heart aching for the lonely child Josephine had been. "Jo," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "My brave, beautiful Jo." But Josephine wasn't finished. She needed to tell it all, to finally release the weight she'd carried for so long. She told him about the nights she cried herself to sleep, about the times she would sneak out to visit her parents' graves, about how she learned to be silent and invisible to avoid her aunt's sharp tongue. "But you know what's strange," she said, her voice growing stronger. "In a way, she made me who I am. Every time she tried to break my spirit, I became more determined to prove her wrong. Every time she told me I was worthless, I worked harder to show my worth." She described how she had thrown herself into her studies, knowing education was her ticket to independence. How she had started working part-time jobs as soon as she was old enough, saving every penny she could. "By the time I was 18, I had enough saved to rent a tiny room near the community college. The day I moved out, Aunt Martha said, 'Don't come crying back when you fail.' Those were the last words she spoke to me." Charles held her tighter, marveling at the strength it must have taken to survive such emotional neglect and emerge with such a capacity for kindness. "The hardest part wasn't the cruelty," Josephine continued. "It was the loneliness. Having no one to talk to, no one to comfort me when I was sad, or celebrate with me when I was happy. That's why," her voice caught slightly, "that's why meeting you changed everything. You were the first person who really saw me, who listened without judgment, who cared about my feelings." She turned in his arms, placing her hand against his cheek. "You know what's ironic? My aunt always told me I was a burden, that no one would ever truly want me around. But you made me feel wanted, valued, loved, without ever seeing my face." Charles leaned into her touch, his heart full of love and protective fury. "You are the most precious person in my world," he said firmly. "Your aunt was wrong about everything. Your kindness, your strength, your beautiful heart. These are gifts that make the world better." Josephine leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "When I'm with you," she whispered, "I finally feel like I'm home. Like I've found the family I lost all those years ago." They sat in silence for a while, holding each other as the rain continued to fall outside. Charles processed everything he'd learned, understanding now the source of Josephine's deep empathy, her instinct to protect others, her ability to see beauty in the midst of darkness. "Thank you for telling me," he said finally, "for trusting me with your story." "Thank you for listening," she replied softly, "for seeing past the walls I built, for loving the scared little girl who still lives inside me." As the evening deepened around them, Charles began to play again, his fingers finding notes that spoke of loss and love, of pain and healing, of a little girl who grew up to be an angel for others despite having lost her own guardians too soon. The music filled the apartment, wrapping around them like a protective embrace, speaking all the words that couldn't be said aloud. In its melody, Charles wove together threads of sorrow and hope, of past pain and present love, creating a tapestry of sound that told Josephine's story in a way words alone never could. "That's it," Josephine whispered as the last notes faded away. "That's exactly how it feels." Charles pulled her close again, knowing that while he couldn't erase her past pain, he could help create a future filled with the love and acceptance she had been denied for so long. In that moment, he silently vowed to spend the rest of his life showing her just how precious she was, how worthy of love and happiness. Little did either of them know that their love would soon face its own tests, that the strength they found in each other would be challenged in ways they couldn't imagine. But for now, in the quiet of that rainy evening, they had shared something profound, the weight of the past made lighter by the power of understanding and love. As the night grew later, they remained entwined on the piano bench, two souls who had found in each other the healing they both needed. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, like nature itself was offering a lullaby of comfort and peace. "I love you," Charles whispered into the darkness. Every part of you, every story, every scar. I love you too, Josephine replied, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. You've taught me that sometimes the greatest sight comes from the heart. And so another layer of their love story was written, deeper and more profound, for the sharing of past pain and the promise of future healing. Their bond, already strong, had been tempered by truth and strengthened by understanding, preparing them for the challenges that lay ahead. Rising above. The early morning sun had barely touched the windows of the Blue Diner when Josephine arrived for her shift, her footsteps echoing in the empty restaurant. At 18, she had already mastered the art of living two lives, full-time student by day, waitress by dawn and dusk, each role a step on her carefully planned path to independence. The familiar scent of coffee and freshly baked pastries greeted her as she tied her apron with practiced efficiency. 6 years had passed since she'd left her aunt's house, but the memories of those dark days still fueled her determination. Every early morning shift, every late-night study session, every carefully saved dollar was a quiet rebellion against the voice that had told her she would never amount to anything. "Morning, sunshine," called Marco, the elderly cook who had taken Josephine under his wing from her first day. He was already at his station, kneading dough for the morning's bread. "You're early again." "Early bird gets the best tips," Josephine replied with a smile, though they both knew her early arrivals had more to do with avoiding the emptiness of her small apartment than any practical consideration. As she went through her opening routine, wiping down tables, filling salt shakers, checking the coffee machines, Josephine's mind wandered to the previous evening's conversation with Charles. Sharing her past with him had been both terrifying and liberating, like lancing a wound that had never properly healed. The first customers began trickling in as the sun climbed higher. Truckers seeking strong coffee, early shift workers grabbing breakfast, regulars who had become familiar faces over the years. Josephine moved among them with grace and efficiency, her smile genuine despite her fatigue. "The usual Mr. Peterson?" she asked the elderly man who occupied the same booth every morning, his newspaper spread before him like a shield against the world. "You know it, Joe," he replied, his eyes crinkling with grandfatherly affection. "And maybe you'll let me leave you a proper tip today?" It had become a gentle battle between them, his attempts to help the hard-working young waitress he'd grown fond of, her stubborn insistence on earning every dollar fairly. Today, as always, she shook her head with a smile. "Your company is tip enough," she said, already moving to fetch his coffee and toast with extra butter. The morning rush brought its usual challenges, juggling multiple orders, soothing impatient customers, maintaining her smile through it all. But Josephine had learned long ago that every challenge was an opportunity for growth, every difficulty a chance to prove her strength. During a rare, quiet moment, she caught her reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine. The face that looked back at her was tired but determined, bearing little resemblance to the frightened child who had once hidden in a basement room. Her dark skin glowed with health despite her long hours, and her eyes held a confidence that had been hard-won through years of self-reliance. The lunch rush brought a different crowd, business people on their breaks, students from the nearby college, young mothers with children in tow. Josephine moved between tables with practiced ease, her mind dividing naturally between immediate tasks and longer-term goals. "How's school going?" asked Sarah, another waitress, during a brief lull. "Still acing those classes?" Josephine nodded, pride warming her voice. "Made the dean's list again last semester, one step closer to that social work degree." She didn't mention the late nights spent studying after her shifts, the careful budgeting that allowed her to buy textbooks, the weekend sacrifice to maintain her academic excellence. These were simply the price of her dreams, and she paid them willingly. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Chen, her former high school chemistry teacher, whose kind words had once been a rare bright spot in Josephine's teenage years. "Look at you," Mrs. Chen said warmly, reaching across the counter to squeeze Josephine's hand. "I always knew you'd make it." Those words, so different from her aunt's constant predictions of failure, brought unexpected tears to Josephine's eyes. "I'm still working on it," she replied softly. "But you're doing it," Mrs. Chen insisted. "On your own terms, with your own strength. That's what matters." As the day progressed, Josephine's thoughts kept returning to Charles, to the way he had listened to her story without judgment, his quiet strength offering support without pity. In him, she had found someone who understood that past pain could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The dinner rush was always the most challenging. Families with tired children, couples on dates, elderly regulars seeking company as much as food. Josephine handled them all with grace, her smile never faltering even when her feet ached and her back protested. "You're an angel," declared Mrs. Rodriguez, a regular whose arthritis made handling utensils difficult. Josephine had quietly cut her meat into manageable pieces without being asked, preserving the elderly woman's dignity while providing necessary help. "Just doing my job," Josephine replied, though the compliment warmed her heart. She had learned early that kindness, freely given, was its own reward. As closing time approached, Josephine began her end-of-shift routine, counting tips, wiping down tables, restocking supplies for the morning crew. Her thoughts turned to the studying that awaited her at home, the assignments that needed attention despite her exhaustion. Marco appeared from the kitchen, bearing a container of leftover soup. "Take it home," he insisted, pressing it into her hands. "You're too thin." Josephine accepted the gift with grace, having learned that sometimes allowing others to help was its own form of strength. "Thank you, Marco, for everything." The night air was cool as she finally left the diner, her tips carefully tucked into her wallet, her textbooks waiting in her bag. The walk to her small apartment gave her time to transition from waitress back to student, her mind already organizing the hours ahead. Her apartment was tiny but clean, decorated with second-hand furniture she had carefully selected and restored. Each piece represented a small victory: the desk she'd refinished herself, the comfortable chair found at a yard sale, the small bookshelf that held her growing collection of textbooks and novels. Settling at her desk with her books spread before her, Josephine allowed herself a moment of pride. 6 years ago, she had left her aunt's house with nothing but determination and dreams. Now she had built a life for herself, piece by piece, day by day. The night stretched ahead, filled with studies and dreams, but Josephine faced it with the same determination that had carried her through countless other nights. Each page read, each concept mastered, was another step toward her goals. Her phone buzzed with a message from Charles. "Thinking of you. You're the strongest person I know." Those simple words brought a smile to her tired face. In Charles, she had found someone who saw her strength not as a barrier, but as a gift, who understood that her independence was not a rejection of love, but a testament to her resilience. As midnight approached, Josephine finally allowed herself to rest, her body tired, but her spirit undiminished. Tomorrow would bring another early shift, another day of balancing work and studies, another chance to prove that she could rise above her circumstances. The sound of rain against her windows reminded her of nights spent staring at stars through a basement window, but now the memory brought determination rather than pain. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her struggles into strength. Later that night, as she finally drifted towards sleep, Josephine thought about how far she had come from that frightened child in the basement. She thought about Charles, about the love they shared, about the future they were building together. Her last conscious thought was a quiet prayer of gratitude, not just for surviving, but for learning to thrive, for finding strength in her struggles, and for discovering that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to be defeated. Little did she know that her strength would soon be tested in ways she couldn't imagine, that the resilience she had built through years of struggle would be called upon for her greatest challenge yet. But for now, she slept peacefully, a warrior at rest, dreaming of a future built on the foundation of her own determination. The next morning would bring another early shift, another day of working toward her dreams, another opportunity to prove that rising above one's circumstances is not just possible, but inevitable for those with the courage to keep trying. And Josephine Devine had courage in abundance, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the power of love. As the night deepened and the city quieted, Josephine's story of resilience continued to unfold, a testament to the strength that lies within those who refuse to be defined by their past, who choose instead to rise above it, one day at a time, one dream at a time, one victory at a time. A special place. 1 year into their relationship, Charles Bolivar discovered what would become their sanctuary, a wooden house nestled at the edge of the city, where the urban bustle faded into the whispers of nature. He had heard about the property through a college friend whose family was looking to rent it out, and something about the description called to him. "I want to show you something," he told Josephine one crisp spring morning. "Well, technically, I want you to show it to me." Josephine laughed, the sound carrying on the morning breeze. "Another adventure." "The best kind," Charles replied, taking her hand. "One we'll share together." The taxi ride to the property was filled with anticipation. Josephine described the changing landscape as they left the city behind, how the buildings grew smaller and farther apart, how trees began to line the streets more frequently, how the sky seemed to open up above them. When they arrived, Josephine's gasp told Charles everything he needed to know. "Oh, Charles," she breathed, "it's beautiful, like something from a fairy tale." Through her eyes, Charles began to see the place that would become their weekend haven. She described the wooden house in detail, its warm cedar siding weathered to a soft grey, the wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides, the way morning sunlight filtered through the surrounding trees to create patterns on the wooden boards. "There's a garden," Josephine continued, leading him carefully up the porch steps. "It's overgrown now, but you can tell it was once lovely. And there's a spot that would be perfect for a bench swing right here on the porch." Charles ran his hands along the porch railing, feeling the smooth wood worn by years of similar touches. "Tell me more," he encouraged, loving how the excitement in her voice painted pictures in his mind. "The windows are big," she said, "with these beautiful old-fashioned shutters. The front door is solid wood with a stained glass panel at the top. When the sun hits it just right, it must create rainbows inside." They spent hours exploring the property that day. Inside, their footsteps echoed on hardwood floors that Josephine said had aged to a rich honey color. The rooms were modest but full of character. Built-in bookshelves, a window seat perfect for reading, a small fireplace with a sturdy mantel. "The kitchen still has the original cabinets," Josephine noted, "and there's a breakfast nook with windows on 3 sides. You can probably hear all sorts of birds in the morning." Charles moved through the space slowly, building a mental map through touch and sound. The acoustics of each room, the way sunlight warmed different areas throughout the day, the subtle creaks and sighs of the old house, all of these became part of his understanding of the place. By the end of their visit, Charles knew this was it. This would be their special place, their retreat from the world. "What do you think?" he asked Josephine, though her joy had been evident in every description. "I think it's perfect," she replied. "But Charles, can you afford this?" "I've been saving," he admitted. "And the rent is reasonable since it needs some work. We could fix it up together, make it our own." The decision was made that day. The house became their weekend project, their escape, their shared dream. Over the following months, they breathed new life into the old house. Josephine would describe what needed to be done, and Charles would work alongside her, his other senses compensating for his lack of sight. They painted walls, Josephine choosing colors she knew Charles would appreciate through touch and description, refinished floors, and slowly brought the garden back to life. Charles learned every inch of the house by heart, exactly 14 steps from the front door to the kitchen, 3 creaky boards near the window seat, the way sound carried differently in each room. He could navigate it as confidently as if he could see, perhaps even more so because his understanding of the space was so intimate. The porch swing was their first major addition. They installed it together on a warm Saturday afternoon, Charles holding tools and materials while Josephine ensured everything was properly aligned. When it was finished, they sat together, swaying gently as Josephine described the sunset. "The sky looks like it's on fire," she said, her head resting on his shoulder. "All orange and pink, with these streaks of purple that remind me of your music." Their weekend routine became sacred. They would arrive early Saturday morning, bringing groceries and projects and dreams. Charles would cook in the kitchen, while Josephine worked in the garden, each of them in their element, but always aware of the other's presence. The garden became Josephine's particular pride. She planted flowers that Charles could appreciate through scent and touch, lavender, jasmine, roses. She described each new bloom in detail, guiding his hands to feel the different textures and shapes. "These are forget-me-nots," she would say, placing the delicate flowers in his palm. "They're tiny and blue, like little pieces of sky that fell to earth." Charles, in turn, filled the house with music. He had a piano moved into the living room, and the sound of his playing became part of the house's character. He composed pieces inspired by their sanctuary, the way the wind sounded through the trees, the rhythm of rain on the roof, the peaceful quiet of early morning. They created rituals and traditions in their special place. Sunday morning breakfasts on the porch, regardless of weather. Evening walks in the garden, where Josephine would describe the changing light, while Charles listened to the day's ending symphony of birds and insects. The window seat became their reading nook. Josephine would read aloud while Charles listened, both of them curled together in the warm patch of sunlight. Sometimes they would pause to discuss a passage, their conversations ranging from literary analysis to personal revelations inspired by the words. "Listen to this part," Josephine would say, her voice taking on the special tone she used for reading. "Doesn't it remind you of us?" Even the process of maintaining the house became a form of bonding. Charles learned to identify problems by sound: a loose shingle, a squeaky hinge, a dripping faucet. Josephine became expert at describing repairs in ways that allowed him to help, their teamwork growing more seamless with each project. The neighbors, though distant, became friendly faces, or in Charles's case, familiar voices. Mrs. Henderson from down the road would bring them fresh eggs, staying to chat and admire their progress on the house. Mr. Patterson, a retired carpenter, offered advice on their renovation projects. As summer turned to fall, they added touches that made the house truly theirs. Wind chimes that Charles selected for their perfect pitch, hanging baskets of fragrant herbs on the porch, comfortable furniture chosen as much for texture as appearance. One particularly meaningful addition was the Braille library they created together. Charles taught Josephine more Braille, and they began collecting books they could both enjoy, building their own unique collection of shared stories. The house became more than just a weekend retreat. It became a symbol of their relationship, a physical manifestation of their love and understanding. Every repair they made, every improvement they added, was a testament to their ability to work together, to combine their strengths and compensate for each other's limitations. "You know what I love most about this place?" Josephine said one evening as they sat on their porch swing. "It's not just a house anymore, it's become a story we're writing together." Charles smiled, understanding perfectly. "Each room holds memories now," he agreed. "I can feel them in the walls, hear them in the way the house has learned to know us. The wooden house near the city became their refuge, their practice ground for the life they dreamed of sharing. Here, Charles's blindness wasn't a limitation, but simply another facet of their shared experience. Here, Josephine's past couldn't cast shadows because they had filled every corner with new, joyful memories. They spent every weekend they could there, arriving as soon as their Friday commitments ended and staying until the last possible moment on Sunday evening. Each visit strengthened their bond. Each project they completed together added another layer to their understanding of each other. "I can see us growing old here," Josephine said one day as they worked in the garden. "Not just visiting on weekends, but really living here, making it our permanent home." Charles paused in his careful weeding of the herb bed, his heart swelling with love and hope. "Tell me what you see," he said softly. "I see children running on the porch," she began, her voice painting the future in vivid colors. "I see holiday gatherings with friends and family. I see us in rocking chairs, grey-haired but still just as in love, listening to our grandchildren playing in the garden we planted." The vision she described filled Charles with a profound sense of rightness. This place, this house, this life they were building together. It was everything he had never dared to dream of before meeting Josephine. Little did they know that their beloved sanctuary would soon become the setting for both their greatest joy and their deepest pain. The wooden house that had witnessed their love growing would also witness their greatest test. But for now, in the gentle warmth of another shared weekend, they continued to build their dreams together, one project at a time, one memory at a time, one moment of love at a time. The house stood steady around them, holding their hopes and plans within its weathered walls, waiting to see what the future would bring. As the sun set on another perfect weekend, casting long shadows across their garden, Charles and Josephine sat on their porch swing, content in each other's company. The wind chimes sang softly in the evening breeze, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "I love you," Charles whispered, his arms around Josephine as they swayed gently. "Thank you for sharing this dream with me." "I love you too," Josephine replied, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you for making all my dreams feel possible." The wooden house settled around them, creaking softly as if in agreement, another day of love and hope absorbed into its time-worn boards, their special place, their sanctuary, their promise of a future filled with endless possibilities. The ultimate sacrifice. The idea came to Josephine on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sparked by a chance conversation she overheard in the hospital cafeteria, where she sometimes studied between classes. Two doctors were discussing recent advances in corneal transplant procedures, and something in their animated discussion caught her attention. "The success rates are remarkable now," one doctor said. "With the right donor match, patients who've been blind for years can regain their sight." Josephine's heart began to race as the possibilities unfurled in her mind. She thought of Charles, of his gentle hands that read the world through, touch, of his unseeing eyes that somehow saw straight to her soul. What if? That afternoon, instead of heading to her usual study spot, she found herself in the hospital's ophthalmology department, asking questions that would change both their lives forever. The more she learned, the more certain she became of her decision. "I want to be tested as a potential donor," she told Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a kind-faced ophthalmologist who had taken the time to explain the procedure in detail. "This is a major decision," Dr. Mitchell cautioned. "You're talking about giving up your own sight in one eye. Are you sure you've thought this through?" Josephine's voice was steady as she replied, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The testing process began quietly, without Charles's knowledge. Josephine scheduled appointments between classes and work shifts, underwent countless examinations, and learned everything she could about the procedure and recovery process. To her joy and amazement, she was found to be a compatible donor. "It's quite remarkable, Doctor," Mitchell told her. "Your corneal tissue is an excellent match for Charles's needs." But making the decision and keeping it secret took its toll. Each time she was with Charles, she found herself studying his face more intently, memorizing every detail, knowing that soon she would see him differently, or perhaps not at all with one eye. One evening, as they sat together in their wooden house, Charles sensed something was different. "Your voice has been carrying a weight lately," he said, reaching for her hand. "What aren't you telling me?" Josephine squeezed his hand, but couldn't bring herself to reveal her plans. "Not yet." "I'm just thinking about the future," she said instead, "about all the beautiful things we'll share together." She spent the next few weeks putting everything in order. She arranged time off from work, prepared for the recovery period, and wrote letters. To Charles, to her friends, to the aunt who had never understood her capacity for love. The hardest part was writing the letter that Charles would find later, after everything was done. She sat at their window seat one Sunday afternoon, watching him play the piano as she carefully chose her words. "My dearest Charles, by the time you read this, I will have given you something I've wanted to give you since the day I fell in love with you, the chance to see the world through new eyes. My eyes. I know you'll be angry that I didn't tell you, that I made this decision without consulting you, but love isn't about asking permission. It's about giving freely, completely, with your whole heart. I want you to know that this isn't a sacrifice for me. It's a gift, the most meaningful one I could possibly give. Every time you open your eyes and see something beautiful, I'll be seeing it with you. Every sunrise, every flower, every smile, they'll be ours to share in a new way. I know you're probably wondering why I kept this from you. The truth is, I knew you would try to stop me. You would tell me it's too much, that you don't need sight to be happy, that you love me just as I am. And you're right. We don't need anything more than what we have. But this isn't about need. It's about love, about sharing, about giving you a gift that only I can give. Remember that day in the garden when you told me I help you see the world in a different way? Now you'll be able to see it through my eyes, in the most literal sense. Every time you look in a mirror, every time you see a beautiful sunset, or a flower blooming, or a child smiling, you'll be seeing it through the eyes of someone who loves you more than life itself. Please don't be angry with me. Please understand that this decision comes from a place of pure love and joy. You've given me so much. You've shown me what real love looks like. You've helped me heal from my past. You've made me believe in myself in ways I never did before. This is my chance to give something back. I know there will be challenges ahead. I know the recovery won't be easy for either of us. But we've faced challenges before, and we've always come through them stronger. This will be no different. I want you to know that I've thought this through carefully. I've done all the research, had all the tests, and made all the necessary arrangements. Everything is in place. By the time you read this, it will already be done, and a new chapter of our story will be beginning. Remember that park bench where we first sat together, where you told me I help you see the world differently? Go there when you're ready. I've left something for you there, a reminder of all the beauty we've shared and all the beauty yet to come. Most of all, remember that I love you. not just with my eyes, but with every part of my being. This gift is just one expression of that love, a way for us to share the world in a new and beautiful way. With all my heart, Josephine. The morning of the surgery arrived clear and bright. Josephine woke early, watching the sunrise one last time with both eyes, trying to memorize every color, every shade, every nuance of light and shadow. She had arranged everything carefully. The letter was placed where Charles would find it after the procedure. Her affairs were in order, and she had a support system in place for her recovery. Everything was ready. Dr. Mitchell met her at the hospital entrance. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" she asked one final time. Josephine smiled, her heart full of love and purpose. "More certain than I've ever been about anything." As they prepared her for surgery, Josephine thought about Charles, about all they had shared, about all that was yet to come. She thought about the moment he would open his eyes and see the world for the first time, see her for the first time. The last thing she remembered before the anesthesia took hold was a prayer, not for herself, but for Charles, that he would understand why she had done this, that he would accept this gift with the same love with which it was given. The surgery itself was a success, though Josephine wouldn't know this for several hours. As she lay in recovery, the doctors began the process of transplanting her cornea to Charles, who had been brought in without knowing the identity of his donor. Hours passed in a blur of pain medication and fitful sleep. When Josephine finally fully awoke, her first thought was of Charles. "Did it work?" she asked the nurse, checking her vitals. "The transplant was successful," the nurse confirmed, "but you need to rest now. You've done a beautiful thing, but recovery takes time." Josephine closed her remaining eye, tears sliding down her cheeks, tears of joy, of pain, of hope, of love. She had done it. She had given Charles the gift of sight. In the days that followed, as she began her own recovery process, Josephine thought about what this meant for their future. She knew there would be challenges ahead: her own adjustment to monocular vision, Charles's adaptation to his new sight, the inevitable confrontation when he learned what she had done. But in her heart, she knew she had made the right decision. Love, true love, wasn't about holding back or playing it safe. It was about giving everything you had, about sacrificing for the one you loved, about finding joy in their joy. As she lay in her hospital bed, her face turned toward the window where she could feel the warmth of the sun, Josephine smiled. Soon, very soon, Charles would see the world through her eyes, and in that gift they would be connected in a way few lovers ever could be. The ultimate sacrifice, she realized, wasn't really a sacrifice at all when it was given with love. It was a gift, a blessing, a way of saying "I love you" that went beyond words or gestures or promises. Little did she know that this act of love would set in motion a chain of events that would test their relationship in ways she could never have imagined. But for now, in the quiet of her recovery room, Josephine was at peace, knowing that she had given the greatest gift she could to the man she loved more than life itself. The sun continued its journey across the sky, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the hospital room wall. Josephine watched them with her remaining eye, imagining Charles seeing similar patterns for the first time, discovering the visual beauty of the world she had tried so hard to describe to him. Soon, she knew, he would read her letter. Soon he would understand what she had done and why. Soon their love story would enter a new chapter, one that would test them both in unexpected ways. But for now she rested, her heart full of love and hope, knowing that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the greatest courage, and that true love means giving everything you have to make another's dreams come true. A new vision. When Charles first opened his eyes after the transplant, the world exploded into a kaleidoscope of light and color so intense it brought tears to his newly functioning eyes. Dr. Mitchell stood beside him, carefully controlling the room's lighting to protect his sensitive vision. "Take it slowly," she advised, her voice gentle. "Your brain needs time to process what your eyes are seeing." Charles blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of visual information. Everything was a blur of shapes and colors, like an impressionist painting come to life. He raised his hands before his face, watching in wonder as his fingers moved, seeing for the first time what he had only known through touch. "The corneal transplant was successful," Dr. Mitchell explained, "but it will take time for your vision to stabilize. You'll need to be patient with yourself." Charles nodded, still mesmerized by the simple act of seeing his own hands move. "The donor," he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Can I thank them?" A slight hesitation in Dr. Mitchell's response should have warned him that something was unusual. "The donor wishes to remain anonymous for now," she said carefully. But Charles was too overwhelmed by his new sense to notice the doctor's careful phrasing. His world, once defined by sound and touch, was suddenly expanding in ways he could never have imagined. The white walls of the hospital room, the sunlight streaming through the window, the various medical equipment, each new sight was a miracle. As the days passed and his vision gradually improved, Charles began to learn the visual world. Colors were the most challenging concept. Having never seen them before, he had to learn to associate names with the various hues he now perceived. "That's blue," his nurse would say, pointing to the sky outside his window, "and those flowers on your table are yellow." He spent hours just looking at things, matching his lifetime of tactile memories with their visual counterparts. The texture of wood grain he had known so well through his fingers now had a visual pattern that fascinated him. The smooth surface of his water glass, the weave of the hospital blanket, the pattern of tiles on the floor. Everything familiar was suddenly new again. It wasn't until a week after the surgery, when his vision had stabilized enough for him to read, that Charles discovered the truth. A letter was delivered to his room, and as he opened it with still, clumsy fingers, he recognized the slight scent of jasmine that always clung to Josephine's belongings. As he read her words, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Each sentence hit him like a physical blow, and the gift of sight he had been celebrating suddenly felt heavy with an unbearable price. "No," he whispered, the letter trembling in his hands. "No, no, no." He tried to stand, to rush to her, but his still adjusting vision made him dizzy. A nurse found him struggling with his hospital gown, trying to dress himself. "Mr. Bolivar, you need to rest," she insisted, trying to guide him back to bed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I need to find her, Josephine. She's here somewhere in the hospital. She gave me her cornea. She sacrificed her eye for me." The knowledge that Josephine had done this, had planned it, arranged it, undergone surgery, all without telling him, filled him with a complex mixture of emotions: love, gratitude, anger, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of unworthiness. When they finally allowed him to visit her, Charles stood in the doorway of her hospital room, seeing her for the first time. She was lying in bed, one eye covered with a bandage, but to him she was the most beautiful sight he had ever beheld. "Joe," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. She turned toward his voice, a smile spreading across her face. "Charles, can you see me?" He moved to her bedside, tears streaming down his face. "Why?" he asked, taking her hand. "Why would you do this?" "Because I love you," she said simply. "Because I wanted you to see the world you've only known through touch and sound. Because I had something I could give you, and giving it brought me joy." But Charles couldn't accept the sacrifice so easily. The sight he now possessed came at the cost of half of hers, and the weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. "You had no right," he said, his voice trembling. "No right to make this decision without telling me. I never would have agreed to this." "That's exactly why I didn't tell you," Josephine replied softly. "Some gifts can't be refused, Charles. They can only be given." The nurse who had been watching from the doorway intervened then, insisting that both patients needed rest. As Charles was led back to his room, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Over the next few weeks, as both he and Josephine recovered, Charles struggled to reconcile his joy at being able to see with his guilt over the cost. Every new visual discovery was tinged with the knowledge that it came at the expense of Josephine's full vision. He began to withdraw, spending more time alone as he adjusted to his new sense. The world was overwhelming enough without the added weight of what Josephine had sacrificed for him. The doctors assured them both that Josephine's remaining eye would adjust, that she would learn to compensate for the loss of binocular vision. But Charles couldn't shake the feeling that he had taken something precious from her, even if she had given it willingly. One afternoon, as he sat in the hospital garden, where he was allowed short walks, Charles found himself studying his reflection in a window. The eyes that looked back at him were his own, but one now contained Josephine's gift. He could see clearly through that eye, while his other remained unseeing. A nurse found him there, lost in thought. "She did it because she loves you," she said gently. "Sometimes love means accepting gifts we feel we don't deserve." But acceptance didn't come easily. Each time he saw something beautiful, a sunset, a flower, a child's smile, he thought of the sacrifice that had made it possible. The gift of sight, which should have brought only joy, had become complicated by guilt and unworthiness. Josephine, for her part, remained steadfast in her decision. Despite the challenges of adjusting to monocular vision, she never expressed regret. Her joy in Charles's newfound sight seemed to outweigh any personal discomfort. "Tell me what you see," she would ask during their visits, genuine excitement in her voice. "Tell me about the colors, the shapes, the way light plays on surfaces." But Charles found it difficult to share his visual discoveries with her, knowing that each one came at the cost of half her vision. The weight of her sacrifice created a distance between them that hadn't existed before. The doctors noticed the tension and arranged for both of them to speak with a counselor who specialized in helping patients adjust to major physical changes. During one session, the counselor asked Charles a question that struck him deeply. "If your positions were reversed," she asked, "if you could give Josephine the gift of music by sacrificing your ability to play piano, wouldn't you do it without hesitation?" The question stayed with him, forcing him to examine his reactions from a different perspective. Would he not have done the same for her? Would he not have given anything to bring her joy? As his vision continued to improve and he prepared to leave the hospital, Charles found himself at a crossroads. He could continue to let guilt and unworthiness create a barrier between them, or he could accept Josephine's gift for what it was, an act of profound love. The answer came to him one evening. As he watched the sunset from his hospital window, the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, exactly as Josephine had described to him so many times before. In that moment, he realized that she hadn't just given him sight, she had given him a way to see the world as she saw it, to share her perspective in the most literal sense. Their love story had always been about seeing beyond physical limitations, about understanding each other in ways that transcended ordinary perception. Josephine's gift, though overwhelming in its magnitude, was a natural extension of that understanding. As his discharge date approached, Charles began to see her sacrifice differently. It wasn't just about giving him sight. It was about sharing her way of seeing the world, about creating a connection between them that went beyond ordinary experience. The final day of his hospital stay, Charles stood in front of the mirror in his bathroom, really looking at himself for the first time. One eye now held Josephine's gift, a permanent reminder of her love and sacrifice. In that moment, he made a decision. He would honor her gift not by drowning in guilt, but by using his new sight to create beauty in the world. He would learn to see, not just with his eyes, but with the same love and compassion that had prompted Josephine's sacrifice. Little did he know that this resolution would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine, that the gift of sight would lead him down paths he never expected. But for now, as he prepared to leave the hospital and begin his new life, Charles held on to one truth. Love sometimes asks us to accept gifts we feel we don't deserve, and the only appropriate response is gratitude. As he packed his few belongings, Charles caught his reflection one more time in the window. The eyes that looked back at him, one seeing, one still dark, reminded him that love doesn't always make sense, doesn't always follow rules or logic. Sometimes it simply gives, completely and without reservation, asking only that we accept its gifts with an open heart. The betrayal. The change in Charles began subtly, like shadows lengthening before sunset. At first it was barely noticeable, a slight distraction when Josephine spoke, a tendency to look away when she caught his gaze, small hesitations in their once fluid conversations. But as weeks passed after his recovery, these small shifts began to accumulate into something more troubling. Josephine, still adapting to her own changed vision, tried to dismiss her growing unease. She told herself it was natural for Charles to be overwhelmed by his new sense, to need time to process the dramatic change in his perception of the world. But there were moments when she caught him staring at his reflection in windows or mirrors, touching the skin around his seeing eye with an expression she couldn't quite read. The first clear sign of trouble came during a routine visit to the hospital for their checkups. As they sat in the waiting room, a young nurse named Alicea Grant approached them with some paperwork. Josephine noticed immediately how Charles's attention shifted, how his newly seeing eye followed the nurse's movements with an intensity that made her heart clench. "Mr. Bolivar," Alicea said, her voice carrying a musical lilt, "your test results look excellent. The cornea has integrated perfectly." Charles smiled, that brilliant, warm smile that had once been reserved for Josephine alone. "Please, call me Charles," he said, his voice carrying an eagerness that sent a chill down Josephine's spine. Alicea was conventionally beautiful, tall and graceful, with long blonde hair and striking green eyes. She moved with the confidence of someone who had always been admired for their appearance, who had never known what it was like to be judged for being different. Over the next few weeks, their follow-up appointments seemed to coincidentally align with Alicea's shifts. Josephine watched as Charles' behavior shifted subtly in the nurse's presence. He sat straighter, laughed more readily, found reasons to extend their visits. One afternoon, as they left the hospital, Charles was unusually quiet. When Josephine reached for his hand, a gesture that had once been as natural as breathing, he pulled away slightly. "Is something wrong?" she asked, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "Just tired," he replied, but his seeing eye was focused on the hospital entrance, where Alicea was just ending her shift. The distance between them grew, measured not in physical space, but in the increasing silence that filled their once animated conversations. Charles began spending more time alone, claiming he needed to adjust to his new way of seeing the world. Their weekend visits to their wooden house became less frequent, and when they did go, the easy harmony they had once shared felt forced. Then came the day Josephine overheard a conversation between two nurses in the hospital cafeteria. "Did you see Charles Bolivar with Alicea in the park yesterday?" one whispered. "They looked pretty cozy for someone who's supposed to be devoted to his girlfriend." "The one who gave up her eye for him," the other replied. "That's cold, even for Alicea." The words hit Josephine like physical blows. She sat there, her half-eaten lunch forgotten, as the reality she had been trying to deny crashed over her. The world tilted and blurred, her remaining eye filling with tears she refused to let fall. That evening she waited outside Charles's apartment, needing to confront the truth head-on. When he finally appeared, he wasn't alone. Alicia was with him, their heads close together as they walked, sharing some private joke that made Charles laugh in a way he hadn't laughed with Josephine in weeks. They froze when they saw her, guilt and defiance warring on Charles's face. Alicia had the grace to look uncomfortable, but there was a hint of triumph in her expression that made Josephine's heart ache. "So this is why you've been so distant," Josephine said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Joe, I can explain," Charles began, but she cut him off. Can you? Can you explain how you could take my gift, part of my sight, and use it to look at another woman, to betray everything we shared?" Alicia shifted uncomfortably. "I should go," she murmured, but Charles caught her arm. "No, stay," he said, and the finality in his voice told Josephine everything she needed to know. "What happened to us, Charles?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What changed?" His answer, when it came, was like a knife to her heart. "Everything changed, Joe. I can see now, really see, and I need to experience the world with these new eyes. I need to understand what it means to be part of the visual world. And you can't do that with me." The words felt like glass in her throat. "Because I gave up half my sight for you." "I didn't ask you to do that." The words exploded from him with unexpected force. "I never wanted you to make that sacrifice. Now every time I look at you, I see what you gave up for me, and I can't bear it. With Alicia, with her, I can just be normal. I don't have to carry the weight of your sacrifice." The cruelty of his words hung in the air between them. Josephine felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked from the world, leaving her struggling to breathe. "I see," she said finally, and the irony of those words wasn't lost on any of them. "I gave you my sight, and you're using it to look away from me." She turned to leave, her dignity the only thing keeping her upright, but Charles's next words stopped her. "I didn't ask for this burden," he said, his voice hard. "I didn't ask you to donate your eye to me. You did that on your own." Josephine turned back slowly, her remaining eye meeting his, the eye that had once been hers. "You're right," she said softly. "Love doesn't ask, it gives. But I never expected my gift would help you see everything except what was right in front of you." She walked away then, her steps measured and steady despite the way her world was crumbling. Behind her, she heard Alicia's soft murmur and Charles's response, but she forced herself not to listen. The next few weeks passed in a blur of pain and disbelief. Josephine threw herself into her work and studies, trying to fill the void that Charles's betrayal had left. She avoided the hospital, switching her follow-up appointments to different days, unable to bear the possibility of seeing them together. But rumors reached her anyway. Charles and Alicia were seen everywhere, at restaurants, in the park, at campus events. He was experiencing all the visual pleasures of the world with someone who had never known darkness, someone who hadn't sacrificed anything for him. One rainy afternoon, Josephine found herself standing outside their wooden house. She hadn't been there since before Charles's betrayal, but something drew her there now. Using her key, the one she still carried out of habit, she entered the silent house. Everything was exactly as they had left it. Charles's music scattered across the piano, their shared books on the window seat, the garden visible through the windows, overgrown now but still beautiful. Each object, each corner held memories that now felt like wounds. She moved through the rooms slowly, her remaining eye taking in details she had once described to Charles with such love. The sunlight filtering through the stained glass, creating patterns he had never seen until she gave him her sight. The colors of the garden she had planted for him, choosing flowers he could appreciate through scent and touch before, but now could see in all their glory. In the kitchen, she found one of Charles's Braille books, its raised dots a reminder of the connection they had once shared. She ran her fingers over the pages, remembering how she had learned Braille to share his world, how she had believed their love could bridge any gap, overcome any obstacle. The irony was crushing. She had given him her sight so he could share her world, but in doing so, she had somehow lost him to it. He had taken her gift and used it to find his way to someone else, someone whose beauty he could appreciate with his newly seeing eye. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the windows, Josephine sat at the piano, where Charles had played so many times. Her fingers found the keys, picking out a simple melody he had taught her. The music echoed through the empty house, a requiem for dreams that had died with his betrayal. Finally, as darkness fell, she took out a piece of paper and began to write. The words flowed from her heart, each one a drop of blood on the page. When you can see this world last time, remember that love gave you this gift. When you look at your reflection, remember whose sacrifice made it possible. I hope the vision I gave you eventually helps you see what really matters. Until then, goodbye. She left the letter on the piano, where she knew he would find it if he ever returned to their special place. Then, with one last look around, she walked out of the house and their shared dreams. The rain had stopped, but the night was dark. Josephine walked slowly, her remaining eye adjusting to the darkness that now seemed symbolic of her future. She had given Charles the gift of sight, but in doing so, she had somehow lost sight of who he really was. As she reached the main road, a car passed by, its headlights momentarily illuminating her face. In the reflection of a store window, she caught a glimpse of herself, one eye now hidden behind an eye patch, the other bright with unshed tears. She touched the patch gently, remembering the love that had prompted her sacrifice. Even now, knowing how it would end, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Love, true love, gave without expecting return. That Charles had chosen to use her gift to look elsewhere was his loss, not hers. Little did she know that this was not the end of their story, that fate had more twists in store for them both. But for now, she walked alone into the night, carrying the weight of betrayal, but also the knowledge that she had loved purely and completely, even if that love had not been enough. Behind her, the wooden house stood silent in the darkness, holding their memories like pressed flowers between its pages, waiting for the next chapter of their story to unfold. The letter. The truth came to Charles on an autumn morning much like the one when he'd first met Josephine. He had been seeing Alicia for several months, immersing himself in the visual world she represented, trying to convince himself that the growing emptiness inside him was just part of adjusting to his new life. That morning, he arrived early at the park where he was supposed to meet Alicia, the same park where he and Josephine had spent countless hours together. As he waited on their usual bench, he overheard a conversation that shattered his carefully constructed illusions. "Did you see Alicia with James yesterday?" a female voice asked. "I thought she was with that blind guy who got his sight back." "Charles? Oh, she's just passing time with him," another voice replied. "James has money, connections. Alicia's always known what she wants." The words hit Charles like physical blows. He sat there, stunned, as memories began to surface. Alicia's recent distraction, her increasingly frequent cancellations, the way she sometimes looked at her phone and smiled secretively. When she finally arrived at the park an hour late, her perfume carrying traces of unfamiliar cologne, Charles confronted her with what he had heard. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Have you been seeing someone else?" Alicia's response was casual, almost cruel in its indifference. James? Yes, he's more established. You were interesting, Charles. The blind man who got his sight back. But did you really think this was going anywhere? I left Josephine for you, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Alicea's laugh was sharp. No, Charles. You left Josephine because you couldn't handle what she did for you. I was just convenient. Someone who didn't make you feel guilty every time you looked at them. She stood, adjusting her designer handbag on her shoulder. You want to know something funny? That girl gave up half her sight for you, and you couldn't even see what was right in front of you. Maybe you're still blind after all. She walked away, her heels clicking on the pavement, leaving Charles alone with the weight of his mistakes. He sat there for hours, watching the sun move across the sky with the eye Josephine had given him, finally seeing the truth with devastating clarity. Everything he had done since receiving his sight, pushing Josephine away, pursuing Alicea, trying to immerse himself in a visual world he thought he needed, had been a betrayal not just of Josephine's love but of himself. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through old photos he had taken when he first got his sight. There was Josephine in the garden of their wooden house, her face turned away, but her posture radiating love as she described a sunset to him, even though he could now see it himself. Another showed her sleeping on their window seat, an eye patch covering her sacrifice, a book of Braille poetry in her lap. She had continued to learn it even after he could see, saying it was another way for them to share their worlds. The memories crashed over him like waves, Josephine patiently helping him learn colors, never mentioning how her own depth perception had been affected by her sacrifice. The way she had celebrated every new visual discovery with him, her joy in his sight, overshadowing any discomfort of her own. How she had rearranged their wooden house to help him learn to navigate with sight, thinking of his needs even as she adjusted to her own new limitations. Driven by an overwhelming need to make things right, Charles found himself walking to their wooden house. He hadn't been there since before everything fell apart, couldn't bear to visit the place that held so many memories of their love. The house looked neglected, the garden overgrown, but still beautiful in its wild state. Using his key with shaking hands, he stepped inside. The silence held echoes of happiness, of love, of music now stilled. On the piano, where he had spent so many hours playing while Josephine listened, he found her letter. The paper was slightly yellowed, suggesting it had been there for some time, waiting for him to find it. As he read her words, tears began to fall from both eyes. The one that had always been his, and the one she had given him out of pure love. Each word was like a knife, cutting through the layers of self-deception he had built around himself. When you can see this world last time, remember that love gave you this gift. When you look at your reflection, remember whose sacrifice made it possible. I hope the vision I gave you eventually helps you see what really matters. Until then, goodbye. The simplicity of her words, the complete lack of bitterness or recrimination, broke something inside him. He sank onto the piano bench, the letter clutched in his hands, and wept. For hours he sat there in the growing darkness, playing the pieces he had composed for Josephine, each note a reminder of what he had thrown away. He remembered how she had described music to him once, like colors for the soul, and realized that in pursuing the visual world, he had lost sight of the deeper beauty she had always helped him see. As night fell, Charles found himself at the window seat where they had spent so many hours together. He looked out at the overgrown garden, seeing it with new eyes, not just the physical sight Josephine had given him, but with the heart she had taught him to use long before he could see. The moonlight cast shadows across the room, reminding him of how he had once navigated by touch and sound, how Josephine had helped him find beauty in darkness. Now, with the gift of sight she had sacrificed so much to give him, he had been blind to the most beautiful thing of all, her pure, unconditional love. Memories flooded back, her voice describing colors before he could see them, her gentle hands guiding him through new spaces, her patience in helping him learn to read print while still practicing Braille with him. Every memory was a testament to a love he had taken for granted, a love he had betrayed. He spent the night in their wooden house, surrounded by reminders of what they had shared. In the morning light, he began to search for her, needing to tell her everything in his heart, to beg forgiveness even though he knew he didn't deserve it. But Josephine seemed to have vanished. Their mutual friends either didn't know where she was or wouldn't tell him. The hospital where she had volunteered had no current information. The coffee shop where she had worked part-time had new staff who had never heard of her. Days turned into weeks as Charles searched, his desperation growing with each dead end. He visited all their old haunts, the college library where they had studied together, the music room where he had played for her, the garden where they had first confessed their love. Each location held memories that now felt like accusations. How could he have been so blind? How could he have mistaken Alicea's superficial attention for the deep, profound love Josephine had given him? One afternoon, he found himself back at the hospital where everything had changed. Dr. Mitchell was still there, and when she saw him, her expression was a mixture of sympathy and disappointment. "You know," she said quietly, "in all my years of practicing medicine, I've never seen a love like hers. She didn't just give you her cornea. She gave you her way of seeing the world. And you—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Charles knew what he had done. He had taken Josephine's gift and used it to look at everything except what truly mattered. That night, he returned to their wooden house, sat at the piano, and began to compose. The melody that emerged was different from anything he had written before, a lament, a prayer, a plea for forgiveness. Into it, he poured all his regret, all his love, all his desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, Josephine would hear it and understand. As he played, tears fell from both his eyes, one his own, one hers, creating a duet of sorrow and repentance. The music filled the empty house, echoing off walls that had once contained their laughter, their love, their shared dreams. Little did he know that fate was about to intervene in a way he could never have expected, that his journey of redemption was about to take a turn he couldn't have imagined. But for now, he played through the night, his music a testimony to love lost and the desperate hope of finding it again. The letter lay on the piano beside him, its words burning in his mind and heart. "When you can see this world last time, remember that love gave you this gift." Now, finally, he truly saw, not just with the eyes she had given him, but with the heart she had taught him to use. He only hoped it wasn't too late. Full circle life has a way of bringing things full circle, of creating moments that echo the past while opening doors to the future. For Charles and Josephine, that moment came on a rainy autumn evening, exactly 1 year after their separation. Charles had been crossing the street, lost in thoughts of regret and searching, when the screech of tires and the flash of headlights pierced the gloom. In that split second, his newly seeing eye caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, Josephine, pushing an elderly woman out of the path of an oncoming car. The impact was inevitable. Time seemed to slow as Josephine fell, her body crumpling onto the wet pavement. Charles's scream of horror cut through the night air as he ran to her, his heart pounding with terror and desperate hope. "Joe!" he cried, gathering her carefully in his arms. "Someone call an ambulance!" Her remaining eye fluttered open, focusing on him with difficulty. "Charles," she whispered before losing consciousness. The next hours were a blur of emergency rooms and urgent consultations. Dr. Mitchell, still at the hospital after all this time, took charge of Josephine's care personally. "She has severe head trauma," she explained to Charles, who refused to leave the hospital. "But she's stable. The biggest concern right now is the damage to her remaining eye. The impact. It's caused significant trauma to the optic nerve." Charles felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Are you saying she could lose her sight completely?" Dr. Mitchell's expression was grave. "Without immediate surgery, yes, and even with surgery, the chances of saving her vision are slim." The irony was devastating. Josephine, who had given him the gift of sight, now faced total darkness herself. Charles spent that night in the hospital chapel, tears streaming from both eyes, one his, one hers, as he prayed for a miracle. The next morning brought unexpected hope. A donor had been found. A woman who had died peacefully in her sleep had left instructions to donate her corneas. One would be perfect for Josephine. "It's not just about the cornea," Dr. Mitchell explained. "The entire eye needs to be reconstructed. But with this donation, we have a chance." The surgery lasted hours. Charles paced the waiting room, tormented by memories of their past, by the weight of his mistakes, by the desperate hope that fate would give them another chance. When Dr. Mitchell finally emerged, her expression was cautiously optimistic. "The surgery went well," she said. "Now we wait." For 7 days, Charles never left Josephine's side. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, talking to her about everything and nothing. He confessed his regrets, his shame, his endless love. He played recordings of his music on his phone, the melodies he had composed during their separation, each note carrying his longing and remorse. On the 8th day, as morning light filtered through the hospital window, Josephine opened her eyes. Both of them, one her original, now healed, and one new, giving her back the gift of full sight. "Charles," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "I'm here," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm right here." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing him with new eyes in more ways than one. "You came back." "I never should have left," he replied, his voice breaking. "Joe, I was so blind. Not when I couldn't see, but when I could. I took your gift and used it to look at everything except what mattered most." Josephine was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "Sometimes," she said finally, "we have to lose our way to find our true path." The weeks of recovery that followed were a time of healing, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual as well. Charles and Josephine talked for hours, rebuilding their connection on a foundation of hard-won wisdom and deeper understanding. "I understand now," Charles told her one evening, as they sat in the hospital garden. "True vision isn't about what we see with our eyes. It's about what we see with our hearts." Josephine smiled, touching the bandage that still covered her healing eye. "Sometimes life has to take everything away for us to appreciate what we had." Their story spread through the hospital, then beyond. The tale of love, sacrifice, betrayal, and redemption. It reached other women who had been betrayed, who had given their all only to be hurt in return. Josephine began receiving letters from these women, sharing their stories, seeking hope and guidance. She responded to each one with the wisdom she had gained through her journey. "Your worth is not determined by those who failed to see it. Like a diamond buried in earth, your value remains constant, whether others recognize it or not. Sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to love yourself enough to walk away, and the greatest strength is found in rising after you've been knocked down. To every woman who has been betrayed, you are not defined by someone else's inability to be faithful. You are defined by your capacity to love, to forgive, to grow, and to move forward. Your heart's ability to love again after being broken is not weakness. It is your superpower." To those who have been cheated on, remember that someone else's unfaithfulness is a reflection of their character, not your worth. You didn't lose someone who truly loved you. You lost someone who never understood what true love means. And to those who have been divorced or abandoned, you are not half a person because someone else left. You are whole, complete, and capable of creating a beautiful life on your own terms. Sometimes, losing what we thought we wanted opens the door to what we truly need. Charles and Josephine's reconciliation wasn't immediate or simple. They took time to rebuild their trust, to heal old wounds, to create a new foundation based on mutual understanding and respect. They returned to their wooden house, now overgrown, but still holding the essence of their love. Together, they began to restore it, just as they were restoring their relationship. Each repair, each renewed space became a metaphor for their healing journey. One evening, as they sat on their newly repaired porch swing, watching the sunset with their foreseeing eyes, Josephine turned to Charles. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked softly. "Everything we went through?" Charles was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I regret hurting you," he said finally. "I regret letting my confusion and guilt drive me away from the purest love I've ever known. But I don't regret the journey that brought us back here because it taught me what truly matters." Their story became a beacon of hope for others, a reminder that love, real, deep, soul-changing love, can survive even the darkest nights. It became a testament to the power of forgiveness, not as a way of excusing wrong actions, but as a path to personal freedom and growth. To the women who read their story, Josephine's final message was clear. Your capacity to love is not diminished by those who didn't appreciate it. Your heart's ability to remain open despite being wounded is not naivety. It is courage. And sometimes the greatest love story isn't about finding the perfect person, but about becoming the person who understands what true love really means. Remember, you are not the mistakes of those who hurt you. You are not the shadows they cast. You are light, you are strength, you are resilience, and your story, like mine, is still being written. Make it a story of triumph, of growth, of a love that begins with loving yourself. As the sun set on their restored wooden house, Charles and Josephine held each other close, their four eyes watching the colors paint the sky. They had come full circle, through darkness and light, through pain and healing, to find a love deeper and truer than before. Their story stands as a reminder that sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of a more beautiful one. That betrayal, while painful, doesn't have to be the end of your story. That the capacity to rise, to heal, to love again, that is the true measure of strength. And so their tale ends, not with happily ever after, but with something more real and profound. The understanding that love, true love, sees with the heart first and the eyes second. That forgiveness is not weakness but the ultimate strength. And that sometimes the most beautiful view comes after the darkest storm. For every woman reading their story, let it be a reminder. Your worth is not diminished by someone else's inability to see it. Your capacity to love is not lessened by someone else's failure to appreciate it. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become. The end. A note to readers. If you have been betrayed, cheated on, or divorced, remember that your story isn't over. Like Josephine, you have the strength to rise, to heal, and to create a life more beautiful than before. Your heart's capacity to love again is not your weakness, it is your greatest strength. Trust the journey, even when the path seems dark. Your best chapter may still be waiting to be written.